Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. Sounds positive over there, anyway. And welcome to the first of the afternoon sessions of the first day of the Communicating the Past conference here in Athens. And the session that I'll be moderating has a very transatlantic flavor. We're going to have three American presentations now, which is exciting to find out what's going on the other side of the pond. First of all, we have Douglas Koller, who is president of IMTAL and an actor, writer, director, and museum educator. He's performed in regional theatre, television, film, and as a radio voice artist. He was a founding member and company manager of the award-winning Actors Art Theatre in Los Angeles and was associate director for the national touring company Chamber Theatre Productions and has served as guest director at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. He was manager of shows and floor programming at Discovery Place Science in North Carolina from 2008 to 2020. In this capacity, he managed the public programs team and the writing and production of all theatrical programming, as well as on-floor interactive demonstrations and support programs for traveling exhibitions. So, an impressive biography. Douglas.
Good afternoon. My name is Douglas, and I am a thief. To make it worse, I am a serial thief. I steal repeatedly, shamelessly. I steal from some of the best in the business, and I steal from some of the least in the business. Not picky. Happens. Later, I will tell the story of one of those thefts. Good artists copy. Great artists steal. Steve Jobs said that. So did Pablo Picasso, T.S. Eliot, Igor Stravinsky, and hundreds of others. To put it another way, to steal from one person is plagiarism. To steal from many is research. We've all been there. The boss says, we need a new thing to complement the so-and-so exhibit. It opens in a month, so we do what we're good at. Procrastinate. I mean, we put off doing anything just yet. Don't want to rush into something. We got to do some research, right? Got to ruminate on the idea. Got to complain about not having enough money. Right staff, or any number of different issues. Plus, there's that other thing that we were working on, the thing that we procrastinated about the last few months that's now due by the end of next week. This is how we work. This is how I work. Your mileage may vary, I know. Used to drive my bosses crazy, used to drive my staff to the point of distraction, drove me to late nights at the computer where I procrastinated some more. And it drove me ultimately to look around and open my eyes at all the wonderful work being done by other people. Work that I could steal. Who's going to know, right? It's not like the family from Hickory, North Carolina is going to visit the Miami Science Center anytime soon, or the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, or the Museum of Natural History in New York. Hell, we're lucky they made the 60-mile drive from Hickory to Charlotte. Look, I worked at a science museum. Programs at science museums are fairly straight across the board. Chemistry and physics. We played with liquid nitrogen. We played with electricity. We made Newtonian fluids. We made liquids change colors. We made really bad smells sometimes. And we got to blow shit up, which was fun. Frankly, if your local science museum isn't doing at least these things, ask for a refund. But we didn't so much steal as just do the same 10 experiments that everybody else was doing. There's no shame in that. What is inspiration, anyway? Well, inspiration is someone or something that gives you ideas for doing something. It's also the act of breathing in. Given our location, amuse, if you will. You will rarely encounter anything, art, music, cinema, theater, food, fashion, that is wholly original, wholly unique. Those pieces do exist, but given the blindingly fast pace of our world, they exist for only the briefest period before somebody takes inspiration and creates a variation. So I've subtitled this Cultural Appropriation and the Challenge of Inspiration. One can be inspired by the manner and accoutrement of a culture different from one's own. I think we all know this. West Side Story was inspired by William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. That is not appropriation. It's a retelling of the story, a story that Shakespeare himself borrowed from the work of Matteo Vandello. What is appropriation in West Side Story is the portrayal of Puerto Ricans by Caucasian writers who had only the barest exposure to the culture of Puerto Rico. And what is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is the use of objects or elements of a non-dominant culture in a way that doesn't respect their original meaning, give credit to their source, or reinforces stereotypes or contributes to oppression. For example, being inspired by Romeo and Juliet to create a theater piece set in the 1850s about a white settler girl falling in love with a boy from the Cherokee Nation. And in telling that story, the writer gives the boy monosyllabic dialogue and uses objects and events of Cherokee culture without acknowledging or understanding Cherokee tradition. It's a steep and slippery slope, cultural appropriation. And it can be as simple or as complex as, is Sebastian the Crab in Disney's The Little Mermaid cultural appropriation? Depends on who you ask. On the one hand, actor Samuel Wright does a delightful job of playing Sebastian, complete with Caribbean patois and Jamaican accent. On the other hand, Samuel Wright was born in Camden, South Carolina, which is not in the Caribbean. Samuel Wright did not naturally speak with a Jamaican accent. Mr. Wright was an actor who spoke with different dialects depending on what character he was playing. And, lest we forget, The Little Mermaid is a Danish story. Disney team was inspired by the original, but set the story elsewhere. There are many more instances of cultural appropriation than there are of cultural inclusion. And much of it is done unconsciously. The Western films of old Hollywood, TV shows of old Hollywood, almost exclusively portrayed the American Indian as savage. Sometimes a noble savage, but still savage, usually played by a white guy. Jeff Chandler, Cornell Wilde, Charlton Heston, or even Chuck Connors, who made for a startling Geronimo complete with brilliant blue eyes. The writers of those films most likely didn't purposely set out to create ignorant stereotypes. They wrote what they thought they knew, what they'd been taught to believe about American Indian experience. Same with the directors, the prop people, the wardrobe people. They did no research, or if they did, it was incomplete, faulty research. Very often you would see Indian characters, supposedly Iroquois, tribe found up here, dressed in clothing that was used by the Tohono O'odham, about 1,900 miles away. The 1970 film Little Big Man arguably was probably the first studio production to attempt to get it right, but it wasn't really until Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves 20 years later that mainstream Hollywood presented native culture with respect. Because these creators consulted with and were given permission by the Lakota Nation of the Dakotas. They avoided cultural appropriation. There are other problems with the film, certainly, white savior complex among them, but cultural appropriation is not one of them. So, from Civil War to ocean crisis, what does all this have to do with? So, in 2012, the IMTAL conference was hosted by the Atlanta History Center. During our time there, we were invited to join a group of visitors on a tour of the American Civil War artifacts. For the program, which was shepherded by IMTAL founder Catherine Hughes, who was then at this institution, we were randomly separated into two groups, Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers, given a sheet of paper on a clipboard with a number spinner, one of those little things you spin around that lands on a number. This paper described a character, a name, background, regiment, available funds, and a rather cryptic listing for health points and morale points. You notice this guy here has 12 morale points and 18 health points. The educators leading the tour were dressed in Civil War era uniforms, and they immediately took charge of the troops, barking orders at us and making us all consider if this was really such a good idea. And after a brief introduction, we began the journey. First stop, we were told to outfit our kit as we prepared to go to war. We had the option to purchase body armor, which would surely keep us safe from all those pesky bullets for $5, or a canteen filter to keep us safe from intestinal bugs for 50 cents, or a mess kit for $5, or buy nothing at all. You'll notice my character had $5 to his name, so I didn't think it was prudent to purchase anything. There were some in our unit, though, who had more money and so bought body armor and a mess kit and a filter. We made our selection. We were instructed to spin the spinner. Depending on where your pointer ended up, you either gained or lost points on health and morale. And if you purchased body armor, for instance, you lost health points because A, you had to carry this stuff. B, it doesn't actually stop bullets. You lost morale points because A, it dawned on you that the armor was heavy and you had to carry it and it doesn't stop bullets. And B, you're out $5, right? There were other stops along the way. At each station, each spin became more and more complex, depending on your choice. Importantly, random chance. Some soldiers wholly survived Antietam. Others were severely wounded. If your character was black, you didn't participate in that round because black troops had yet to join the Union Army at the time of the First Battle of Antietam. The artifacts were fascinating, stories were heartbreaking, and the experience was illuminating on a basic level. We journeyed through 7 different galleries, and at the end of this harrowing passage, at the end of the war, you tallied your points. There were 4 outcomes. You could be alive and sane. You might have kept your sanity, but lost your life. You could have gone insane and died, or worst case scenario, you ended up alive and insane. After chance decided your fate, you were asked to turn the sheet over. And I was surprised, quite frankly, that none of the 40 people on the tour had not yet done so. But as we did, we were told and saw what really happened to our character. Because every character in the experience was actually a soldier who fought in the American Civil War. Educational, memorable, powerful, and worth stealing. When I returned to Charlotte, I gathered my staff and I told them the story of this experience. I wanted to offer something like it, but Discovery Space Science is a science museum. We had occasionally, socially significant exhibits like Body Worlds or the Dead Sea Scrolls, but most of our work encompassed science and nature. We offered live science demonstrations on our small stage. We had an aquarium tour, a rainforest gallery, scripted animal show. Wait a minute. Rainforest, aquarium, World Alive Biology Space, their last act. Wait a minute. Okay, aquarium tour. What if, hear me out here. What if we used a theoretical, devastating current event as the basis for this adaptation? We had an aquarium, we had rainforest animals, we had people. We devised a program called the global game, Survive. The object was to gather a crowd and distribute character cards along with a number spinner. We didn't have actual Civil War soldiers to draw on for our characters. We did have a rainforest full of birds and animals and lizards and snakes and an aquarium filled with fish and coral. And we had visitors from all over the world. These became our characters, the animals and the people of the planet. Can't get more authentic than that, right? The animal characters were all species that lived at Discovery Place Science, along with one exception, which we'll get to. Sharks, frogs, birds, lizards, snakes, tortoises, fish, octopus, human characters from the Amazon, the Congo, Ghana, Indonesia, Europe. Character cards look like this. And again, you'll notice health points and resource points. That's important. The story we told is set in the year 2020. I know. Remember, this was in 2013. Who could have predicted such an devastating global crisis? Or rather, who could have predicted the devastating? Okay. So, first station was the biodiversity globe. Facilitator talks about trade negotiators representing the United States and China reach an agreement on new far-reaching limits on energy usage, carbon output, chemical runoff, deforestation, coastal development. But the treaty still needs to pass the US Senate and the European Union, and other industrial and developing nations need to follow suit. The European male is asked to step forward. He must choose whether his company will support or oppose this agreement. If he supports the agreement, it will cost his company 1/5 of their profits, but he will live in a cleaner world. Now, why did we choose the European male to start the game? Because as in life, decisions by white males have far-reaching consequences. If the character chooses to support the agreement, the facilitator's point allotment differs from those he would assign if the white guy won't support the agreement. And that has a trickle-down effect in the game. There are 5 stations in the game. We start at the very large biodiversity globe. The rainforest, the aquarium. Every character is affected by all situations with the exception of one. The North American house cat. Health points, 20. Resource points, 20. We went through several incarnations of this game over the years. In its initial form, the game took about 45 minutes, the required group of about 20 people to play. And we created a shorter version, which could be played with about 6 or 8 people. We played it with families, we played it with school groups and corporate clients, but it never became a regular feature because marketing, right? It does require a fairly extensive rehearsal process, but marketing wouldn't put it on the schedule regularly because it was not a paid program, and they could push the IMAX films for $5 ahead instead. This is just one story of theft. I got a bunch of them. I'm not sure we ever hit the improve part of this. Adapt, adopt, improve. But we strove to make it challenging, educational, and a fun experience, and I think we succeeded. We wouldn't have had it at all if it hadn't been for that program in Atlanta. So, look around your world. Look what you're doing, what others are doing. Approach the creator of a program, if possible. Express your delight and how inspired you are by the work. Then ask permission. This is a common courtesy, obviously, and one that's skipped quite a lot. Surprisingly, most creators are willing to be your inspiration, work with you, grant permission. In the case of an absent or deceased creator, as long as you flat out don't plagiarize, you've got every right to use those ideas to inspire you to create your own vision. Now, offer your work, make your scripts, make your programs available. And try not to listen to your marketing team. Adapt, adopt, and improve, and maybe, just maybe, share alike, and steal benevolently. Questions? Thanks.
Many questions do occur in the meantime. There will be an opportunity after the last speaker to revisit. So, moving on now, we have our second presentation of the afternoon, and this is Elizabeth Keeney, who is from George Washington's Mount Vernon in the USA. Elizabeth is a passionate museum educator who advocates for object-based, visitor-centered experiences. Ms. Keeney currently serves on the IMTAL Americas board and believes that improv, theatrical technique, storytelling, and creative dynamics breathe new life into collections and gallery teaching. Heartily agree. She has taught history, art, science, and language arts in museums across the United States, and she currently portrays Martha Washington at George Washington's Mount Vernon.
Hi, friends. If I start talking too quickly, just wave your hand and tell me to slow down because there is a lot to say. know I've talked with you a little bit, some of you last night, about things going on. I do work at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Of course, Washington was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American War of Independence and later served as the first president of the United States. His home is situated 16 miles south of Washington, D.C., and it was a plantation. And I just want to make sure that we have terms clear. Plantations were established in mostly the southern part of what became the United States from the 17th to the mid-19th century. They were usually quite large agricultural complexes that generated wealth for white enslavers by exploiting the labor of men, women, and children. And yes, slavery existed for thousands of years, but when it came to what became the United States, it changed drastically. It became based on race, it was hereditary, and in almost all cases, a permanent status. You will notice that a lot of museums in the US now, when talking about enslavement, use that term, enslaved, enslavement, as opposed to slave. That is, again, to remind everyone that these were people that was a legal situation put upon them and not who they were. Mount Vernon passed down to the Washington family until about the 1850s. In 1853, an organization of women that called themselves the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, they started to raise money. The house was falling apart. The founder of the institution's mother said, you know, if the men of America have allowed the home of its greatest hero to fall to ruin, why can't the women of America save it? And they did. They raised $200,000 and purchased the home in 1858, and it's been open to the public since 1860. And it's by no means the only plantation museum in the United States. Mount Vernon's right there in the center on the cover of Historic Houses of Virginia, which is a lovely coffee table book showing all of these plantation homes, still for sale at Mount Vernon's gift shop, by the way. And then an older publication, Plantation Homes of Louisiana, and Virginia's James River Plantations. So these, for well over 100 years, have been destinations. Now, some of them, like Mount Vernon, are presidential homes. Someone significant lived there, something significant happened there. A lot of the other ones that are founded, and you'll find in the United States, are just big, old, fancy houses. And unfortunately, the way they've been interpreted for many years has been solely from the perspective of the white enslaver, and not the people whose labor produced the wealth to get these lovely homes. And they are beautiful houses, but again, built on the back of people forced to labor all their lives. In fact, there's a movement in the United States to change the word plantation to forced labor camp to really recognize what was going on. Some places you'll go and visit and you'll see someone in a costume, again, very much dressed as a wealthy white person. At Mount Vernon, which we had some construction going on, our history interpreters, those are the people that guide visitors through the house itself, wear a uniform, khaki pants, and a polo. We do have costumed people, some in character, some not, but that's not the experience of the house. Back after the murder of Michael Brown in 2014, and of course, exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd in 2020, people in the US really began to reflect on plantation museums. And there's a big, larger context about plantations themselves. There are plantation museums that people have weddings at. You know, isn't that nice? Look at that pretty little outbuilding. Well, no, that was quarters for enslaved people. Now you're using it as a backdrop for your wedding album. And a lot of places, you know, again, like Mount Vernon, which is a presidential plantation, were really tasked with trying to do more and to really recognize that this is something that is not just an add-on, but a vital part of the interpretation. And there's been a lot of success. I've never had the opportunity to visit it. I've heard just wonderful things. Whitney Plantation in Louisiana is a historic plantation museum, and you don't learn about the white enslavers. The entire interpretation is about those that lived there that, again, generated that wealth, their lives, because of course they did more than work there, and the focus is on that. So they've created a brand new model, and they opened in 2014. And you have a lot more descendant voices, because the other thing that is a unique situation with plantation museums, we often have living in our communities the people that descended from those that labored at places like Mount Vernon and Montpelier. And so starting to work more with them. But back to Mount Vernon. We always talk about Mount Vernon in 1799. That was the year George Washington died. And you can see a painting of the house that was done about a year and a half before. And the Washingtons and their granddaughter on the lawn, and I know it's a small picture, but in the back you can see some of the enslaved workers. But that's generally how people think of Mount Vernon, is this beautiful house of George and Martha Washington, and that's not incorrect. But when you look at the graphic of who was living at Mount Vernon in 1799, all of the folks in blue were enslaved men, women, and children. The ones in red were hired servants and their families. And then the 5 little green folks, that's the Washington family. So we've been telling one story, and look just how very small it is. Now, when Mount Vernon opens to the public, it becomes a shrine. Actually, it was a shrine during Washington's time. When they returned from the presidency, the Washingtons hosted 677 overnight visitors in 1 year. So you think about Caroline Branham and Charlotte and Molly, the housemaids, not only keeping the house clean, but caring for the visitors. Doll and Lucy and Nathan that were cooks. Again, all of those people that were represented in that graphic, the amount of work. And I tell you, when people hear that and they come and meet me as Martha Washington, the first thing they ask is, would you less like to entertain? And I actually had to create a whole tour about what it means to have a house that size, what it meant to have that many guests, and who was doing that work. Washington himself said his home was like a well-resorted tavern. Anyone traveling north to south, south to north, they were stopping at Mount Vernon. And that continues to this day. The photograph of the ladies in black and white surrounding the bust, those are the original Mount Vernon ladies. And the smaller, more modern picture is them again. They don't let them take the bust out and pose with it on the lawn anymore. So it is still a private nonprofit run by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And we host, again, everybody. You can see FDR and Churchill. They're doing a wreath laying at the tomb. Next to them is Fidel Castro. You have a Saudi delegation. In the Kennedy administration, they held a state dinner for the president of Pakistan and his daughter at Mount Vernon. And students. The picture just there shows some students in the 1920s and a more modern picture. We used to have a program where Mount Vernon was trying to get a photo or an image of George Washington in every American classroom. So that's this group posing with their picture. And between mid-March and the end of June, this is pre-pandemic, Mount Vernon welcomes over 500,000 people in that about 100 days alone. Almost all of them are students. So you think about the impact that the stories that we're telling can have and what people will take away. So what's really interesting is actually some of the first interpreters at Mount Vernon were men of color. The gentleman in the center is Edmund Parker. He worked as an enslaved man at Mount Vernon. After emancipation, the ladies hired him to serve as a guard at the tomb of the Washingtons. And they were the precursors to our special conservators of the peace that we have today. But you can see the badge that he's wearing. They had a uniform and badge. And now he certainly had been enslaved at Mount Vernon and would talk about that. But that tradition kind of continued down. And Thomas Bushrod, who's just next to him, had never been enslaved himself. And we know from white visitors' recollections of the stories that some of these gentlemen would tell. And they'd get kind of performative, talking about what it was like to be enslaved at Mount Vernon when Washington was alive. And I wish someone had actually interviewed them, because the recollections that we have from the white visitors that spoke with these gentlemen are very rosy. And again, I would love to know, were they working for tips? Like, I'll tell you what you want to hear, just, you know. So, but it is interesting that historically, some of the earliest people interpreting the history of Mount Vernon were people of color. And Mount Vernon did move with the times, sometimes begrudgingly, sometimes not as quickly as possible. The image in the center is the original marker at the burying ground for the enslaved people. It's interesting because it is one of the earliest markers in the United States that acknowledges a burying ground for those who had been enslaved. But if you can't read the language, it says, "In memory of the many faithful colored servants of the Washington family." So language that we would not quite use today. In the 1980s, Mount Vernon partnered with an organization called Black Women United for Action, and they worked with students at Howard University. That's a historically black college in Washington, D.C. And their design students came up with the modern memorial that we have that was dedicated in 1983. The old memorial is still there, and it is still maintained. It's an important part of the history and how Mount Vernon's history was told. But again, starting to make some progress. The lady in the lovely red beret is Gladys Quander Tansel, and she had a very long and illustrious career in the federal government, but as a retired woman, came to work at Mount Vernon as a historical interpreter. She was the first person of color to do that. This was in the 1980s, and she actually was a descendant. The Quanders were one of the families that we know worked at Mount Vernon. And in the 80s and 90s, she helped develop the very first tour talking about the experiences of the enslaved. And then in 2009, we had the publication of Sarah Johnson's Mount Vernon. She was a woman that had worked at Mount Vernon, both enslaved and free, for more than 50 years. And it talked about her story and the stories of those that really built it. But it was still kind of an add-on. It still wasn't something that was necessarily central to your experience when you came to Mount Vernon. But we continued to grow. In 2016, Mount Vernon opened an exhibition called Lives Bound Together. It was the first full exhibition dedicated to the lives of the enslaved. And of course, Lives Bound Together. Enslavers and the enslaved were really connected in very intricate, complicated ways. But it wasn't, well, this person did this and this person. It was, who were these families and what were their lives like that we can know of? Because unfortunately, we don't have their own recollections for the most part. It was meant to be up for 2 years. It just closed last year, so they extended it. And now it's going to be incorporated into our redesign of the Education Center. So we're doing, moving. Where does character interpretation come? So the history of character interpretation at Mount Vernon is much like the history of Mount Vernon itself. I love these photos. This is in my boss's office. I have no idea what kind of programs these people did, but they had lovely costumes. And they were the first person group. And they portrayed Washington family members and visitors. But again, all coming from white perspectives. And if any of you attended the 2013 conference, you recognize Mary Wiseman. Beginning in 2002, we had our first full-time character. Of course, that was Martha Washington. And the general was never an on-staff member. He was contracted in, so you might see him at the wine festival, like they're there in the center of the 4th of July. But you now had someone regularly interpreting Mount Vernon using museum theater character interpretation, but from this one perspective. 2007, we started our full-time character department, and they finally hired people of color to tell these stories. But at the same time, it was still focused on the Washingtons. At that time, our mission included the words that we will remember Washington's life, achievements, and legacy. So you could talk to Frank Lee, excuse me, William Lee, sorry. You could talk to William Lee, who was Washington's enslaved valet and served all 8 years of the war with him. But you were going to get, here, let me tell you about Washington, not let me tell you about Frank Lee, William Lee and his brother Frank, who was the butler. Caroline Branham, I mentioned before, was an enslaved chambermaid. But again, it was still very much in the context of you're going to learn about George and Martha Washington from the people that were around them. And then we did try to have multiple perspectives, but the best way we found to do this was in large-scale programs that we couldn't run on a daily basis. So the one up top was a program called Is Mount Vernon Burning? During the American War of Independence, a British ship came up to Mount Vernon, dropped its anchor, pointed the guns at the house, and said, give us supplies, and any of the enslaved people who would like to, you're free to come with us. And so this was a scene, or a program where there were various scenes at different times. And so the one is Captain Graves telling them that they could take their freedom if they went with the British. And then a discussion between them, well, what are the risks, what are the benefits? And then discussions between them and Graves again. If you're interested, 17 people left. Almost all of them were recaptured by Washington by the end of the war. The bottom program was one we did not long after Night at the Museum, Escape the Smithsonian came out. So we stole. And this was a program where, and you can see in the center, that's a history interpreter dressed up like a security guard, taking a group through the museum, and the character interpreters bring them to life. So there, Christina is portraying a woman who's at the swearing-in of George Washington as the first president. And these talk of individual rights and liberties that we're all born with. Well, as a Black woman in the early United States, she doesn't have those. Again, Willie portraying William Lee with Washington during the war and fighting for liberty, and what does that mean? And that's baby Elizabeth mourning Washington and talking about his legacy. But unfortunately, this was not something we could always put on. We didn't have the staff, we didn't have the time, And because Mount Vernon has so many visitors, we often don't have physical space to do things like this on a regular basis. So most often, when people come to Mount Vernon, they'll meet one of our characters. That might be Caroline Branham, portrayed by Brenda Parker, Tobias Lear, who was Washington's secretary, Mrs. Washington. There's Frankly, or Dr. Craig. But again, our biggest struggle was, what if they only talk to Mrs. Washington and they don't get a chance to talk to Caroline? So we've created programs that no one took photos of, that were sort of movable feasts and were much more easily to be done a couple of times a day. Visitors would gather between the kitchen and the house where Doll, who was one of the cooks, would be waiting for Mrs. Washington, and she would engage with the visitors with conversation, talk about, and then Mrs. Washington comes out the cellar. There's an interlude with the two of them, and very participatory. This was, you're here with us and you're engaging with us. And then Mrs. Washington leaves. So Doll has a chance to actually speak from her perspective, and not just when Mrs. Washington's around. We also started to center the stories of the enslaved. When our mission changed, it became the legacies of George Washington, which is much more appropriate because there are lots of legacies. So now we would have programs where Christopher Shields, who replaced William Lee as Washington's valet, is talking about his life and his experience, not just who he is in relation to Washington. He was a grandson of Doll, who was the cook, who had actually come with Mrs. Washington to Mount Vernon when the Washingtons were first married. So here you've got 3 generations of people and family and stories. Brenda there is doing a performance called Freedom Skies, discussing what happened when Washington died in '99. In his will, he freed the people he owned. Out of the 317 people enslaved at Mount Vernon, that was only 123 of them. And so talking about the various perspectives, I had mentioned Frank Lee. He was married to Lucy, who was the daughter of Doll. And Frank would have been free under Washington's will. Lucy was not. And they had 3 children, Patty, Mike, and Philip. So can Frank be joyful? What about his family? So she would, switching out costumes, have a whole program. And again, yes, the Washingtons are involved because it is in Washington's will. It was a legal process that had to be done. But it wasn't really about them. It was about those families. And the same with Reggie there portraying Frank. And we expanded to more, not just, here are the Washington facts and wanting to get everything, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but cultural things. So there, Washington and a Continental Soldier are reading Cato, which was very popular with the revolutionaries. It was the only theater Washington allowed performed during the war. They had a stage performance at Valley Forge. But also, what are the cultural traditions that the enslaved people would have brought? So this was a program called Maudie Maisie that used storytelling song and the role of the griot, the storyteller, to make sure that visitors were learning there wasn't just the one kind of history happening here. And then in 2018, the Summit on Teaching Enslavement happened at Montpelier, which is another presidential house. It was the home of James Madison. And they created this document. It's known as the rubric. And it is basically what are the best practices to teach enslavement for students, for adult groups. And the biggest point that they made is you have to engage these descendant communities. The descendant communities have the oral history. It was their ancestors that built the labor, that built the wealth, and without their voices, you can't tell the story fully. And Mount Vernon, again, has had really great relationships. The Syphaxes have a connection. Martha Washington had a half-sister who was enslaved. She'd never actually lived at Mount Vernon, but some of her descendants did. And then that traces a family that they've stayed in the area, done tons of things. They founded schools. We also worked with the Quanders. I had mentioned Gladys Quander. But it was very much an informal relationship. But happily, just last year, they formed themselves into an organization, the League of the Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon. And not only were they instrumental in getting some of getting the work done for the Lives Bound Together exhibit, we're now going to actually be using them for all of our character and museum theater programs. That they will not just be a stakeholder or a partner, but leaders in really how are we telling these stories, and is there something that we're missing, and what could we be doing more? And so it's still in the early stages, but we're thrilled that they're going to be having a much more formal role in interpretation, particularly character interpretation here at Mount Vernon. Thank you, Fred.
Fascinating. I don't know if any questions have come out of that particular talk at all. It's a lot to cope with. I'd just like to ask, you might want to come back, just to ask about demographics.
So Mount Vernon doesn't do a lot of evaluations. It is a mostly white audience. That has changed a great deal. And I've worked at Mount Vernon on and off since 2004. I keep going back. So in the past, it was a majority white audience. That's changed, and it's changed our policy. For example, when I first started at Mount Vernon, there was a wreath laying at the Washington Tomb every single day. There were wreath layings at the enslaved burying ground in the month of February, which in the US is Black History Month. Now they're every day. And some of that is us learning and doing, when you know better, you do better. But also knowing that what our visitors expect and what we should be doing. But no, it is still mostly a white audience. Absolutely.
So, last but not least, comes Jacqueline Coleman from the University of Washington. Jacqueline Coleman is an actor, director, writer, and emerging museum professional. Creating immersive and innovative experiences for audiences inspires her to be a part of the museum theatre field. She holds a degree in museology with a specialization in evaluation from the University of Washington and received a Bachelor of Arts degree in theatre arts from New Mexico State University and a Bachelor of Science degree in anthropology from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. In the past 2 years, she's worked for the Museum of Pop Culture and the Highline Heritage Museum. She has developed museum programming while interning for the History Museum at the Castle, who she also partnered with for her virtual museum theatre thesis project. Currently, she's an event and volunteer, she's not currently an event and volunteer intern with Horton Esquali. This is an old biography. She was, but this led her on to her new role, which is now the Senior Living History Interpreter at the High Desert Museum in Bend, Oregon. She's a member of AAM and IMTAL. And so, Jacqueline.
Hello. Creating a museum theater project in the winter of 2020. What could possibly go wrong? How many people here have created a virtual museum theater program? Okay, a few. Well, I wanted to make a museum theater program. Has anyone heard of Harry Houdini? Yeah, okay. Harry Houdini, as many of you already know, was a famous magician of the 20th century. Some of his most famous tricks included suspended water torture cell, the buried alive stunt, and the straitjacket escape. He was born in Budapest, 1874, and he and his family arrived in the United States 4 years later in 1878 and lived in Appleton, Wisconsin. One of Houdini's famous quotes says, "The greatest escape I ever made was when I left Appleton, Wisconsin." And that's exactly the city I ended up creating my virtual museum theater thesis project. Back in the summer of 2020, I was a second-year student in the museology graduate program at the University of Washington. And I had landed a remote public education internship with the History Museum at the castle in Appleton, Wisconsin. I was in Seattle, Washington, and the museum was in Wisconsin, so it was done completely remotely by Zoom. I helped create and develop 3 tours during my internship with them. A cemetery tour, a Prohibition pub crawl tour, and what they call now the Museum After Dark flashlight tour. Combing through their 20,000 inventory database while developing the flashlight tour involved finding the strangest and creepiest artifacts I could find in the collection. It was really fun. Among many Houdini artifacts, I stumbled upon a painting of Houdini and this unknown woman. I knew she wasn't his wife, Bess Houdini, because of the caption, which read, Harry Houdini and Dorothy Young by Dorothy Young. What? Who? The possibilities, I thought. Having developed a professional relationship and friendship with the staff at the museum, I found out that they were open to trying something new and different. Sometimes in the States, with the smaller history museums, they can be more open to trying anything with programming. I pitched an avant-garde theater program idea, and right away they wanted to partner with me, which was great. For those of you who might be asking, what do you mean by avant-garde theater project? We know that avant-garde in theater is known for being thought-provoking and its ambiguity, and the way I was thinking about it, it's the use of sound and music with different styles of acting, like expressionism, noir, instead of a program being plot-driven. The staff also expressed a need to create a program to attract millennials and Gen Z visitors, Generation Z visitors. Just gonna let you know from what I found, current literature states that both millennial and Generation Z audiences engage more with museum programming that is immersive, provides unique experiences that are entertaining, and lead to learning and have a combination of depth and breadth. So thus, my program, I decided to call it Pushing the Boundaries, experimental theater project at the museum, because they had never even done living history, let alone any type of museum theater. Partnering with the museum and giving me free overall open freedom, I had found my inspiration, which I stole a little bit too. I wanted to know as much as possible about Dorothy Young and her relationship to Houdini. This woman painted a portrait of herself with him, which you can see right up there on the right, my right, yeah, okay. With my past acting experience, I was drawn to do something avant-garde with styles like expressionism, like I mentioned before. I had also taken a dark tourism independent study class with the University of Washington drama professor, Scott Magelson, who had written the book, Living History Museums, Undoing History Through Performance, which you can see right up there as well. I wanted to try something different in a history museum besides living history. The book talked about theater as fabulation, therefore can't be completely authentic. The endless narratives that we could create. This really stems from what Scott Magelson describes as theater of the oppressed. Theater of the oppressed is a method created by the Brazilian playwright Augusto Boal that stimulates critical observation and representation of reality, envisioning the production of consciousness and concrete actions. It can be a problem-solving technique in which an unresolved scene of oppression is presented. And then it's replayed for the audience with them being invited to stop the action, replace the character they feel is being oppressed, and improvise an alternate solution. I could cast anyone as Dorothy and create a tour. I plan to fly there and implement it in the winter of 2020. Then in the fall, things have been looking up with COVID in the States. But just like that, in November of 2020, the mask mandate went back into effect and museums began to close in many areas of the country again. The History Museum at the castle closed for a second time, and for a moment, it seemed all hope might be lost. It seemed like the only theater that was being produced was in Zoom boxes with just their heads and small casts with virtual audiences. My project went completely remote. All rehearsals, final filming, everything. It couldn't any longer be a tour with a one-woman show through a museum. My process and activities for this project include research, like we've been talking about so much during today. Research. I found on eBay Dorothy Young's journal of her time touring with Houdini. The only place I could find my primary research was on eBay. And I also found a movie, Hollywood movie that had been based on her life through eBay as well. And just any article clippings, anything I could find on Dorothy Young. The site coordination, goal setting, collaboration with Lawrence University, creating and managing a budget, script writing and revision, music and sound copyrights, creating choreography, location scouting, equipment and costuming, rehearsals, and filming and post-production. So, the 5 crucial activities for my project included relationship building. Myself and the staff got to know each other really well. We communicated weekly through Zoom. I found out what the staff was interested in. During 2020, I think that's when the musical Hamilton came out to Disney+. We really bonded over that. And what our common interests were. I worked on 3 different tours with them. So like Houdini says, never tell an audience how good you are. They will soon find out for themselves. My inspiration, number 2, that was a crucial activity, as we all know we've been talking about today. Working on another tour with them, the Flashlight Tour, led to inspiration, but I also had time. I had 3 months before my last year in school, so I had 3 months to research and prepare for this before planning even began. My best choice was to collaborate with the Lawrence University Theater Department and create an independent study class for my actress. I was able to do some outreach to the theater department, ask them, hey, do you have maybe a student in Appleton, Wisconsin who wants an opportunity to do a full one-woman show? And luckily they said yes and had a very strong actress who I ended up working with on this project. And she was also able to earn credit, and we could have designated times for rehearsals, and we also made an honorarium for her as well. I know we always don't need to have trained performers, but it saved my program. If I hadn't had her, I only had 10 months to do this. We implemented it in 3 months. Incentives like credit, money, and resume building will help produce a higher quality of performance out of an actor and dedication. At least that's what I got from my project. Recording a virtual play takes a lot of time. Time for editing is essential, and getting feedback to see what can make the story clearer or better. As many of us know by now, if you're creating a virtual program, be aware of where you're filming and what your access to tech is like. To engage the audience and not being in the space, I needed time to test the tech equipment and set it up. And by set it up, I mean I had to ask others for their time to do it for me. I also needed time to modify the actor's performance depending on how it was being perceived through the camera. We filmed it through Zoom, me being in Seattle, Washington, and them being at the one staff member and the actor being in the museum in Appleton, Wisconsin. One day of tech before final filming would have been so much beneficial. We did not do that. We basically did the tech on the final day of filming. That's my actress up there. 4 takeaways from this project. These are my lessons learned. More time for experimenting with the film aspect and tech rehearsal. For the museum in particular, visitors enjoyed the virtual theater play. We did an evaluation on it. We learned about the subject and they learned about the subject and wanted to know more. The museum learned how to engage with an audience through a camera and have used the best practices from this project on feature programs. In the museum field, guidelines for the virtual and in-person programming and a cross between film and theater was evaluated. An eval survey instrument example seemed to indicate that visitors are ready for virtual theater programming and film theater hybrid, virtual immersive storytelling, and possibly cross reality. Audiences also went along with the Hamilton effect with the use of mixed media methods, photos, and performance. So when I talk about the Hamilton effect, I mean that just because Dorothy Young was a white woman, I felt like we could cast anyone in this role, including a person of color, as you see up here. And I didn't get any responses about this being confusing to the audience. And I think if you end up watching my program, you'll see that we put pictures throughout of the real woman, and then my actress would come on and do her performance as well. Very interesting. And of course, the Hamilton effect is by Lin-Manuel Miranda and his musical play Hamilton. Now, I wanted to show you all a trailer for my project called Dancing with Houdini. And speaking of humor, it's kind of a light, silly trailer. Okay, thank you. Any questions? I also have links to my project up there if you want to see the full short virtual program. And if you can't remember or take a picture of this, I can give it to you sometime during the conference.
So, the first question I was going to ask in that case is, how long does the entire session run? 13 minutes. And, generally speaking, it's been interesting over the years, about 20 minutes seems to be a really good time, 20 minutes or below, to engage with an audience in a gallery, and it's interesting that that's translating over to film as well. Does anybody else have any questions?
Jacqueline. Hi. Congratulations. That's really nice. I was wondering how this was adapted in the museum programming. I mean, it's on their website. How do they use that?
I forgot to say, they had put it on their Facebook website. So History Museum at the Castle, it's on there. 2021. You'd have to scroll a ways, but if anybody wants to see it, I'm more than happy to share it through email as well.
Yeah, I will be happy to see it.
I have a question for Jacqueline as well about the audience. Do you know anything about them? At the end of the day, this is a film, video, isn't it? And I have a question for Douglas the Thief as well about these characters, the survival game, about the audience and the reaction of any feedback from the visitors or players. Thank you.
We had several instances of family groups and school groups participating in Survive, the global game. It was also offered as a pop-up program, which meant that the two presenters who were in the revised script were Mother Nature and Father Time, chasing down visitors and getting them involved and roping them into playing this game. Ultimately ended up, the final revision of the game was about 20, 25 minutes. But we never knew what we were going to get as visitors come into the museum. So a lot of times it was a mixed bag of, I don't know who the other people I'm playing with is. So that was sort of an odd dynamic for people to get used to. Once they got through the first round, I think they were very comfortable moving as a unit throughout the galleries. But yes, to convince people to play a game with strangers sometimes is rather odd. The actors did a great job of convincing people.
I have it's one for Douglas, but it's something that your comment about the IMAX being a preferable solution to the institution. I was wondering how can we engage? I mean, people in such projects, such games, like many people in that. I mean, I was wondering how we can increase, because this is a problem that's coming up very often here as well, that you cannot engage many people in live interpretation.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any ideas from your experience, or have thought about that. How can we solve this?
It's an interesting proposition. One of the interesting factors about Discovery Place was that they were very clear about not having upcharge experiences unless it was for a traveling exhibition, something like the Van Gogh Alive experience or Body Worlds or something like that. So anything that we did in the museum had to be offered with admission. The only exception to that was IMAX, because we had an OmniMax theater, and they would be relentless in selling these school groups a 40-minute IMAX film, rather than, and they're just sitting there passively taking this in, rather than participating in something that causes them to engage their brain and their muscles. So we never solved that issue. We did have an option to put the global game in as an offering for school groups so that they would come specifically to play the global game. And then, by the way, also could explore the rest of the museum. But that didn't take off. People weren't buying it. Because when offered the big screen IMAX experience, we had a dome as well, a 4-story dome, or wandering around the aquarium space, the teachers are going to want to take that 45-minute film and not have to engage with those children, those screaming children for 45 minutes. So they almost always opted for the film. It's unfortunate, but that's an ongoing issue. There are other institutions in the States that have figured out a way to do upcharges for individual programs, add-on programs, so that you pay one admission cost, but another participation, a theater project, for instance. The Franklin Institute in Philadelphia did that, where you could get character engagements on the museum floor, but if you wanted a scripted show with explosions and with chemistry, that cost you additional. And that worked very, very well for them. But it wasn't something that Discovery Place was ever interested in doing. Yeah.
The other thing I would add to it is we talk about, researching the content, but we need to research the audiences. So for example, Mount Vernon, again, would get those 500,000 students from mid-March to the end of June. Sometimes that's 7,000 people in one day. And, they're not going to, because they've got their tour leader, dragging, I'm sure they come to Athens too. It's the same kind of thing. So, okay, we know we've only got them for maybe a few minutes. What is the best way to use characters? For a while, and they redesigned the whole house tour for when the students are there. They had a standing on the lawn where they come out the kitchen and there would be the characters there. I do a program that's just called Meet Mrs. Washington, and for up to 3 hours, I'm in a room. People can come and go as they like. It's not scripted, it's conversation. And again, we want to make sure that the guides know, yes, bring them in. It doesn't matter if they can only stay for 2 minutes. In the summertime, when it's mostly families with young children, then it's story time. So again, thinking about what your audience needs and what kind of programming you can do to support that. So.
Thank you all. I'm interested in the film as the media, and it's new for most of us, and many of us has tried it. And at the same time, our expertise, I think, is reacting to the audience, to be live performers. And the film denies us that communication. And my experience, just from what we've made on my museum and also from what I've seen other museums has done, is that if we want to keep on doing this, we need to dive into this media and to to become experts on that as well, because we don't have the possibility to see that the audience reacts, how they react, when they react, and all these kinds of things. And as professional museum workers, we need to also be professional on that media and not just jump in and do it. Of course, in the pandemic, we had to just jump in. But now I think we have to be even wiser and re-educate us. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I desperately wanted it to be an in-person program. Being 2020 and that I was in a different state, all I could do was come up with a survey instrument. And for anybody who watched it on the Facebook page or at the time YouTube, I could then send them a Google link. I had made a Google Doc survey for them to fill out. So I was very limited. Not everybody filled out the survey, but from what I got, it was received pretty well. But yes, I definitely think if we're going to do more virtual programming, evaluation is a must. We need to find out how audiences are reacting to museum theater virtual programming or any virtual programming, period. Yes, definitely.
Would you say that this experience inspires you to do more of this kind of work, or is it, or do you eager to get back to the traditional?
I love traditional, and right now at my theater, at my museum, I mean, we're having a blast doing in-person live interpretation museum theater program. Like we just did a melodrama, but there are people who cannot access the museum, and I think it's really important that we start dipping in more to virtual museum theater programming to give those visitors who can't always come to the museum a chance to participate and to see where we can go with that.
Here, here.
It wasn't about anything I talked about in my part, but Mount Vernon does, and Colonial Williamsburg, History at Play, a lot of the Facebook Lives, and Mount Vernon uses WebEx, they have reaction buttons, and people will send their little likes, they'll send claps. My laptop is so old I can't run WebEx on it, so I was doing Teas with Martha Washington from my home on my cell phone, and they did finally get me a laptop that worked. But someone that was running the other end would just say, oh, and Mrs. Washington, we've got a question. So there are ways that you can use those to be interactive, and all the characters did it. We were doing one live stream every single day, but it's not as scientific as, you know, a nice a survey, but, you know, it got this many likes, it got this many views and this many hearts. Just maybe a new way of evaluating.
And I think something else for us all to consider is the archival aspect of it. I was fortunate in that my predecessors, 25 years before I started at Discovery Place, had filmed a few programs. So we knew what they used to look like and what could be changed, what couldn't. The Rainforest program comes to mind. But every program I did from 2008 all the way through the time I left was archived in some way, whether it was reblocked and reshot for specific presentation purposes or just archival purposes. So it exists somewhere in a vault at Discovery.
Okay, the last question, because as you talk, more questions come in mind. And another question that I have for you, that you are, as well as interpreters and creators of content, actually. What about the rights?
The rights to the programs that we create? Yeah. It depends on who you ask. If you asked me, I said, sure, go ahead, take the program, do it at your institution. If you asked the senior team, they would want you to pay. So you have to find out who actually is in control, who controls the purse strings. I have no objection to selling the programs, but I think it benefited the museum theater field to make those programs available either free or at a very low cost. That's not always the case, but one program that we wanted to do at Discovery Place to tie in with an exhibit was called About a Door, which was actually a winning script in our competition from the Adler Planetarium. And if I had gone to the Adler administration and said, we want to do your 14-minute play, they would have said, yes, that will be $800 a week. And I went to Mark Webb, who was the manager at the time, and he said, yeah, sure, go ahead, do it. So we never had to get that way. So I think it depends on who you know as well.
The rights were, I made sure to pick all photos for my program that were public domain. I paid music rights. If you watch my program, any music that's used, I paid for it. And then the museum and I decided to make the program free for any audiences, especially during COVID, just for accessibility, and COVID was challenging. And but yes, because I made it through the University of Washington, I basically own that specific project. So yeah, it's free for anybody to watch.
Our model at Mount Vernon is if you are paid while you're creating it, Mount Vernon owns it. What's interesting is that a lot of us do outside work, freelance work, so there's a lot of real gray area. Sometimes costumes get used. But a general rule of thumb is if you're being paid, if you're on work time, then they own it. But if it's something that you created on your own, feel free to use it anywhere.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for our three speakers and presenters this afternoon. I think we've learned a lot. Huge amount of food for thought, and the fact that museum theatre is definitely adapting to the current conditions, evolving, developing new techniques that we can use which have the advantages of a much wider global reach and can engage with a lot more people, touching on Panteion's point, than just the people in a room. We can go far beyond that. At a recent event for Keats House, which was held online, they said usually they'd get 15 people to attend in person. They got about 400 coming from America, Australia, Japan, Italy, Germany, and they were absolutely thrilled by the result of that. So I think these are exciting times ahead, and I've certainly learned a lot this afternoon. I hope everyone's inspired, and again, do seek out these presenters as well during the conference. I'm sure they'll be happy to chat further about anything. We're going to move on to a workshop session now, I believe, with Angela Feniger. So thank you very much.
Hello again, everyone. This time I'm me, I'm not Icon Grease. Much more comfortable. I hate being stuck behind a microphone, but I think that's probably best for everyone. But before I start, and I'll show you some pictures and stuff, so we'll be seated for the first couple of minutes. But I don't want us sitting all the time, so I'll just ask you, I'll stay here so you can hear me, just ask you briefly, sort of stand up, everybody. Because I don't know what you feel like. Yes, that's a spirit, lady. Stretch a bit. Fuck's sake, we've been sat all day on our asses. That is wonderful. Don't know how many people we are. Just look around, about 30, 40, I don't know. Lovely. And now everybody, do me a favor. Can you just point to yourselves, like show yourselves. This is me. Point to yourselves. Look around. Keep pointing and look around how people are. Wonderful. Great. And notice how most people are doing this, and no one is doing this. It's because we are emotional beings, and of course we want to address that empathy in our work as well. And this is very much the tenor of all the talks we've been hearing, and some of this activity that we'll be trying out firsthand later. But remain standing for a wee second. I want to ask you a few things. Who of you has seen a museum theatre or live interpretation program? Just give me a nod. So a few people are nodding. Most of you are. Okay. If you've seen one that you thought was poorly done or crap or boring, can you please give me a yawn? Look around and everyone. Okay, a few saw crap ones. Okay. If you've not done any performing or any such work yourselves yet, can you just hum? So we don't know who you are, but we'll hear how loud it is. Just you are humming, so you've not done that work yet. And those of you who've done that sort of work, can you please give me a bow? And look around. Wow, that's quite that is fantastic. And bear in mind who's been bowing, because there'll be the poor sods who'll be leading the group work later. Wonderful. Do sit down. Thank you for your little activity here. Yes, I was going to divide my session up into, is this the pointer thing? Okay. Hurrah, it's working. Into a few sections. So I will talk a bit. I wrote to myself, it's more to myself than to you. 10 minutes max. Jacqueline, watch the clock. 10 minutes are over, you give me a loud bleep. Okay. I tell you when you start counting. I'm still talking. We'll do a little practical exercise that is sort of word-based. So we'll still be sitting down, but you'll be required to put the little thinking hats on. Then we'll split up into 4 groups. And then we'll meet again and see what the 4 groups have come up with. And then, obviously, once we've shown each other our results, we'll sum up and say, that was crap. No, we won't. It'll be brilliant. So, start counting. Okay, I'll have to probably always look away a little because I can't remember what I wrote. That was last week. Jesus, I'm old. Okay, so some of you who are not yet so familiar with the terminology, you will have heard in the course of the previous talks that some of us were talking about first person and third person. And if that term is not something you know very well, this is just to remind you, just briefly, first person is what you mostly associate with this type of performance. You dress up as a person from the past and you pretend to be that person. But it's not the only way to go about it. And if you visit museums that are dealing perhaps primarily with ancient history, where there's very few written sources that you can rely upon, many people will prefer third person. That is, they can dress up like someone from the Stone Age, but they have no idea what the language would have been like, or what the religion was, or poetry, or song. So they have a hard time incorporating that person, and they might just talk about them. And of course, there's also the second person. I've put that down for, completion's sake, which is what Andrew was talking about this morning when he said, oh, you come in as the captain and you greet the audience, say, as people applying to be crew on your ship. So the audience know what their function is, but they also get offered a safe space, so they feel they don't need to know anything about running a ship. It's fine if they just stand there and say, yes. Okay? So we've heard a lot about different characters telling their stories, and it's always interesting to consider who is telling the story. Is it the winner of the battle, or is it the losing party? Is it an old person or a young one? Is it a male or a female voice, or are there several voices? And it's always interesting if you have a chance to provide a program with more than one voice, because of course you can give a far more balanced view of history if you branch out and not just monopolize one version or the master narrative of the winner who will always tell you what's right and what's not. I'm going on about this a little, it sounds a bit theoretical, but we'll get better soon, I promise. So what we often rely our research on is biographical data, which refers to perhaps larger developments, like if you, looking at Elizabeth, if you do Washington's wife, you're not just a woman and you can talk about a household, but you can talk about, nation building things, like larger context things. And the form this can take, we've also seen this today, is not just digital or live. It is also different forms like, is it a monologue? Is it a dialogue? Someone being interviewed, perhaps? Or do we have the same character talking to themselves as an old and as a young person, for instance? You can split one perspective up into life ages. That's often very interesting. I did a program once on Charles Darwin, whose views changed considerably between the point in time where he was a young man and when he was older. You can also tell, and this I quite like, meta stuff. I love my meta stuff. So, how do we perceive history in the first place? It's a construct, right? We're aware of this because we're studying and working in that museum and public history field. For most visitors, they don't reflect on these things very much. They take as a given what you tell them, and very seldom do we get TV programs or anything that will question the way in which history is actually recorded and handed down or presented in the public sphere. And this is one great strength of our method. Whichever variant you use, you can make that a topic and reflect upon how our notion of history is changing over time, or how an institution is being run, or why it was founded in the first place. I will show you some pictures for examples that will make it a bit clearer. Also, you can have an inanimate object talk, like Andrew's figurehead of the ship, like she was a carved wooden lady who came to life and told us the history of the ship. So you don't even have to choose a human perspective at all. And it's all down to an early question when you develop a program. One of the first things I sort of ask myself is how realistic or how mimetic do I want my program to be? And there's a whole range of means of expressions you can choose from. And there's probably no right or wrong way to go about this. But I tend to see which theme I want to communicate to the guest and decide the level of abstraction, is that abstraction? Should fit the theme. For instance, give you an example just now. In Germany, where I come from, any history that is after 1914 is very much coined by 2 world wars, which we're to blame for. So German interpretation of 20th century history is a horrible thing to do. But sometimes you get a commission, it has to be done, it's important, it should be told. But for me, it's always hard to have very recent history where you might have eyewitnesses in the audience, or the children of people who've had that experience in the audience. Who am I to tell them how they felt? I feel really awkward about something that's so close to the bone. So I tend to go more abstract on these programs and less descriptive. And everyone has to find their balance on this. It's just a thought I want to leave with you. I didn't mean to switch, it just did. It's the matrix. One such example, you're watching the clock. I don't see you watching the clock. Okay. Oh, good. One example for institutional history, I mentioned that earlier, is a program I do every year when there's no COVID on, for a Roman fortress. And that Roman fortress, it was built about 1900, and we play the time when it was built. We don't play Romans, which is great because it frustrates the audience. Yay! They come with a certain expectation. They want to see legionaries or whatever, and they see 19th century people wandering around. And the performers very much play with the audience expectation, and they represent the worldview and the view of history of their time, which today we would not stand for. So you see an image of like what they thought a Roman looked like when the museum was first opened, which we now know is dead wrong. And the agenda that we're unpacking to the visitors in character is really sexist and imperialistic. My God. Like, if you spoke like this as a modern person, everyone else would say, rightly say, hey, hold on a second, you can't put it like that. But it's the spirit of the time this was founded as an imperialistic gesture to basically sort of kick yourself out with glorious history and make yourself look good. On the right-hand side, I just put in a little picture, something I like to use when I do programs that aren't too far back in history. I always look for digitized newspapers. They're brilliant. You find them for free on the internet. Print them out and take them with me so you've got the news of the day in your pocket, which is brilliant. So this is a Zeppelin collapsing near the site where we're performing. So here you see the aesthetic of the opening of the Roman Museum, very much people in bed sheets. And a royal visit to the site we're performing. So royal visits were quite a common thing at the time, and that's what the exhibit looked like. And we performers pretend it's still that, and we pretend the emperor is about to come. And, oh God, isn't he great? And he will make Germany great. And all that crap that we nowadays frown upon is the subject of our performance. So we have that royal visit idea and improvise a lot, but also have fixed times where we do demonstrations. You see a Roman around 1900 who obviously looks the part, and we're sort of laughing because it's like ridiculous, showing weaponry that is reconstructed wrong. But at the time, it was state-of-the-art scientific results. Yes? I'm jumping on to another thing. I was mentioning interview. You could have a modern person interviewing an historical one. You could have two historical persons having a dialogue, asking questions. This format I did some years ago for Heidelberg Castle. It's a famous site, Inga knows it very well, in Germany. It's flooded with tourists, mostly American, Japanese tourists, also German and Swiss and everything. And it's famous not just for the building, but also for its history and the inhabitants. And we chose 4 characters from its history, 3 real ones, a fictional one, who would talk about the castle and what it means to them, and what they think should be done with it today. And we also had the general manager of the palace's administration on the panel, which was interesting because the historical figures had a go at him for marketing their property. And that was quite a laugh. But of course, it was sort of just logical. So here we've got my colleague Birgit on the right-hand side. She was playing Prince Elector's daughter. I think so, Ingo, isn't it? Prince Elector's daughter? Wife? No, daughter. Lieselotte is a famous inhabitant. So she obviously argued in favor of keeping the place as a family home, okay? And an art historian from around 1900, 200 years later, who says, oh, we have to rebuild this, or do we have to tear it down, or do we leave it as is? And we had this whole discussion about how should a monument be preserved at all. I'm just racing through this now. This is a program, Ingo will recognize it. We reenacted a picture, this one here, as a tableau vivant. So basically, we dressed up like these people and put ourselves in this position. It's a medieval wedding, but the picture you can tell is more modern. It's not a medieval painting. And the stuff on this painting is all wrong. And that was the subject of our play. So Inga was playing the groom and I was playing the bride. But historically, the bride was 12. And the groom was like 54. And so we swapped my role. We got a girl from the audience. She was prepped, mind you. I mean, she knew what was coming. We got her on the stage to replace me, and you could just see the audience gape, because that's child pornography today. But it's a common medieval practice. No one thinks about it. Once you see it, you think, fuck me, this can't be right. So this was very controversial. We got a lot of shame and hatred after this performance. And some people came and thought it was brilliant. It was a love or loathe thing. You couldn't be indifferent to this. And I think that's the last example piece I've got. This is a picture I stole from an old Insights magazine. That was a lady in Australia. Jo, I don't know whether she's still active, Zoe Meager. I wasn't privileged to see the program, but the imagery itself blew me away. Zoe is very much influenced by pop art culture, and she loves science fiction. And she played the ghost in the machine of a first supercomputer. So an inanimate object, again, can find its form in a performance space and tell the story of the revolution in the workplace, how people suddenly got obsolete because the computers were coming in and all that. So you can see there's quite a span of topics that museum theatre can address, and not just the first person monologue, I'm this person, but you can do all manner of things. I think it's always good, you need to make an informed choice and be able to justify that choice or the level of abstraction. And once you can do that legitimately, just go for it, be wild. Okay, we'll do a little exercise in a second, which I stole. I think I stole it. Yes, there's a few books that I suppose everyone has a short list of books that I like. I keep consulting Stacey Roth, past into present, a lot because she's got like lovely checklists of how to build a character. You can't forget a thing because she goes all through all of it. I'm also playing history by no, it's not Catherine Hughes. It's it'll come back to me. Anyway, so you get these sorts of exercises in the books. And I think this variant was also done in the training course that Past Pleasures offered in Hungary. Eva was there. You might recognize something like this. I don't know if they used that there. So, yes, what I'm aiming at here, if you're preparing a character, in that case, a first-person character, so you play the role of someone from the past. You want to be logical about it and plausible about it. Is one on the one hand is research and assembling many, many facts, but how do you structure the facts that you find? And this is quite a handy tool that I like to use because it's so quick and dirty. I don't, most of us don't have the time to sit down for weeks and be all very, very super meticulous. This is you place your character in the center of this mind map and imagine like what a typical day or a typical week for them would have been. So you look at the top section, for instance. You've got your first family. Who are your parents? Who are your siblings? Who do you live in a house with? You've got your own family. Do you have a spouse? Do you have children? Do you have the unmarried spinster aunt who lives in your space and gets on everyone's nerves? Which obligations do you have? Or which duties do you regularly perform? Which chores in the household do you have to look after? Do you have any leisure time at all? And if you do, how do you fill it? Or if you move on to the right a bit, your network's far wider than family. It involves people you go to the shops to, or handyman who repairs your stuff. So it's tradesmen, neighbors and friends. Who do you borrow your eggs from if you're baking, you run out of stuff? And these are all things that you probably might not find in the history book, but very handy to have at the back of your head because it allows you to improvise around a theme for quite some time, actually, without having to know 100 books worth full of hard facts. And a lot of it is about plausibility as well. Like if you move down the ladder, mobility. So say your character lived in the 17th century. What type of vehicle would they use? I'm just asking the group. What do you reckon? Just shout out. 300 years ago, how would you travel? By horse? Carriage? On foot? Or you could take a ship, perhaps, if you're near a river. Sorry? Sedan chair. Oh, if you're rich, yeah, wow, lady, you've got pretensions. So yes, so you've got these modes of movement. So that would obviously determine the distance you can cover. How far do you think you could get in one day on foot? 20 miles. I suppose, yeah, if you're fit, perhaps that much. A few breaks in between. If you've got a horse, you could cover perhaps a bit more, 30 or something, depending on the state of the roads, something you talk about, wonderful. The English still do. So your daily routes, how large is your world, would very much be determined by which means of transport can you use. It's just one example. So it's all one thing links up to another. Are you rich or are you poor? Where does your money come from, if you've got any? Does it come naturally? Are you a private person of leisure? Or do you have to work for it? Do you have staff working for you? How do you pay them? So all these things are very useful, handy tools if you build a character, even with what is first very little information. If you think about circumstances that would be representative of a particular time that you want to show, or social class that you want to show. So if your character's poor, they don't have a horse, they'll have to walk. And that will limit the distance or whatever, they can carry on their person or something. So many of these things, they have their repercussions, or do they have a profession? I'm moving to the right. So if they're educated, they had professional training, perhaps their job has a certain language, like you've got, if ever you've got stuff being fixed in your house, right, and you've got a plumber come in, especially if you're a woman and the tradesman wants to impress you, will they use bizarre words to make you feel worthless and stupid? Yes, the hell they will. And I'm sure it's always been like this. This professional lingo, you can look up individual words to spice your act up a bit. You can also comment upon whether your job is stable or whether it's really insecure or whether you have to do it because your father was a doctor and your grandfather was a doctor and you'd much rather have studied law, but now you have to be a doctor. So these are all interesting elements that can go into a character presentation. Now, I don't want to dwell on this forever, but I see most of you have photographs with mobile phones. If you want, as a reminder, because they'll split up in a second, take a picture of this. If you're looking for aspects to use later. I suppose the seasoned interpreters might not think about this much, but perhaps some of the newbies will, before I continue with the next thingy slide. So, is that all right? Okay. Moving on. Okay. Now, it's enough of me waffling here up front. It's time for you to get active. Oh my God. My evil plan is to split this group up into 4 subgroups. And as you know, the title of my workshop is Visitors to Greece Through the Ages. It's not quite so much through the ages as I initially thought it would be when I registered with the title. I thought, oh, I'll do it through the ages. Most of it now sort of centers on 19th century history, actually, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. I've chosen a few characters plus potential counterparts for these characters that could represent something about Greek culture or the visitor's own culture, to see if there is any appropriation going on or any benevolent theft. I keep quoting you now. And how that person was living in Greece at that time and how did they perceive their environment and all that. To that extent, I've sort of consulted with Fontini beforehand. I made a list of potential people. Is this crap? You have to tell me. And so we talked about it and we chose like some of these. You find first a female. I wanted a balance between male and female characters, so you have a choice which group to join if you've got a stronger interest in one or the other. The first one I'd never heard of until you mentioned it, Christiane Lüthe. She was living in Athens at the court of the king, was king at the time. And the king, strangely, bizarrely, was Bavarian. What? So it's German king being flown in. Of course, he brings all his own people. And she was part of that package. Interesting person because she left us a diary. I didn't have time to read the entire diary, but put together a little dossier on her life. So she'll be one possible character that you could focus on. The second one is an architect, also German, who came in and very much left his mark on the Athens cityscape because some of the, some of the iconic, no, go back, Jesus Christ, how does that work? Stop. Some of the famous buildings and very residential, sort of representative buildings go back to that phase where the Germans were the rulers here, and they sort of flew in their own architects as well. And Ernst Ziller, that's how he's pronounced, he was one of those people whose work is still visible in the city and who stayed on, and he seems to have liked it because he took on Greek citizenship, married here, and is buried here now. So we've got another type of character. Then I've got a double mention. The first thing I thought of in that whole context was, for me, of course, Lord Byron. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that story, but Lord Byron died in Greece fighting for Greek independence. Of course, he was a poet and a womanizer, and people in his day thought he was like devil incarnate. And then I was looking up Lord Byron, and I found that he had, amongst his many amours, was fancying 3 Greek sisters at the same time. Oh, for bloody hell. And they were all underage, of course. And one of them, he particularly took his fancy, was Teresa Macri, for whom he wrote a poem which has been set to music. So that group will have the added benefit of having a ready-made song. Whoa. So there we could have either Lord Byron or Teresa Macri, or the both of them, separately or together, talking about that early 19th century history in Greece. Or we make a leap back to the fourth group, well back in time until the Middle Ages, hurrah, something further back, when a rather, for me, unexpected group of people arrived here and sort of left a fleeting mark, which was the Viking community. I hadn't really known about this until we prepared for the conference, and Thomas is somewhere. Where are you, Thomas? He's escaped. Bugger. I need him for this one. So anyway, Thomas Olsen, who's Scandinavian, he was mentioning that, and what
Hello, welcome everybody again in this third session, the last for today. My name is Anna Mikoniati. I'm a curator at the National Museum of Contemporary Art here in Athens. If you haven't been, you should. It's very close. And we had some experience at the museum with the museum theater, so I'm really happy to be here and learn. And I will moderate this session. So I think this session is, as you know, is titled Museum, Theater and the City. So probably it will be a really good chance for all of us to exchange best practice examples. We will listen to 3 presentations. They are all case studies. And we will start with Mrs. Styliana Galiniki. Mrs. Galiniki is an archaeologist. She's the head of the Department of Sculpture and Stonework, Wall Paintings and Mosaics Collection at the Archaeological Museum in Thessaloniki. That's in the north of Greece. And she has also studied theater in Thessaloniki, and her PhD has to do with theatrical practices and tools as well. So her presentation title is Active Monuments Performing the City at the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki.
Good afternoon to all of you. An ancient larnax placed in a museum is a dead member detached from the still alive body. It tells us what Thessaloniki may once have been, but it can never tell us. What it is now. Museums, as much as they help us study history and art, are still graveyards of the past. People who admire them sometimes are moved, as we are moved by the memory of dear deceased persons, but they refuse to incorporate them in their life. This view, expressed by the writer George Vafopoulos in 1962, the year of the inauguration of the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki, marks the ongoing but exciting challenge museums, especially the archaeological ones, have to face to become landmarks of everyday life in response to the needs of contemporary people. The special theme, Polis, set by the European Heritage Days in 2017, was one more challenge to explore how we, as curators in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki, could reunite the museum antiquities with the living body of contemporary life. Could antiquities function as living subjects of the city's history, telling known, even silent or untold stories of our time? With these questions in mind, I suggested to the then director of the museum, Mrs. Adam Veleni, that our participation could be through a theatrical performance based on an original text about the discovery of some of museum's exhibits. She trusted me, and I wrote the text of the play by synthesizing information from the Museum Historical Archive, local press archives, and literary sources. So I was a thief. The play, entitled Active Monuments, The Museum is Performing the City, was presented twice during the European Heritage Days in September 2017. It was staged in collaboration with the National or State Theatre of Northern Greece and directed by Kiki Strataki, who adapted the text, reducing its length and introducing inventive elements. Her choices, as also the quality of the performance of the actors, certainly served the stage economy and enriched the textual composition. Here I will talk to you about my choices in the composition of the text, my concerns and goals. Museums and sometimes archaeological teams in the field of excavations increasingly organize or host imaginative theatrical events as a beyond learning stimulus that highlights the timelessness of human condition and provoke the visitor's emotional and intellectual responses, offering a relational experience strongly recorded in their memory. it is also certain that the museum-theatre connection opens up areas of collaboration and research for people from both fields. Additionally, the common qualities of museum archaeology and theatre have already been pointed out by many scholars, so a lot of are among us. Both fields tell stories and play roles that carry social meanings. Both are staged and addressed to an audience that constructs collective memory and identity. Of course, the two fields share many differences, as their asymmetry. The museum is considered as a place of authority and truth, and the theatre a place of in subordination and fiction. But we could say that both of those Foucauldian heterotopias are certainly spaces of identity transformation, as the material objects of museum collections are somehow disguised, like actors, as they have been transformed from material objects, into evidence for the narrative of the past. The milestone for this, I'm sorry, yes. The milestone for this transformation of monuments is the time of their discovery. As Nasia Krumziadi writes, the path of an archaeological find from excavation field to museum display is a construction that contains the values of a multitude of mediators. So, focusing on discovery conditions, the play aimed to highlight the active role of monuments in the construction of social memory and collective identity. In this case, of the city of Thessaloniki. The idea was that monuments could be considered as participants in social drama, as co-performers of the contemporary urban experience, reflecting on the identities of individuals and groups related in various ways to them. As the theme of the celebration prompted the exploration of the urban phenomenon, it was the museum visitors who, being both theatre spectators and city residents, could activate the connection between the museum, the theatre, and the city. The city is, after all, the theatre of memory, as Lewis Mumford argued in 1937. We might say, as in the classic logic game, that if the museum is a theatre and the city is a theatre, then the museum is a city, an active network where social dialectics is produced and produces social space. The theatrical text consists of 3 acts dedicated to 3 museum masterpieces that came to light in different times. The acts unfold on different levels, recalling the stage phenomenon of a theatre within the theatre, but in a version closer to the time within the time described by Jerzy Limon. I could say that the play presented a type of museocenic phenomenon, that of a museum within the museum. Present time is displayed as a tour. An archaeologist guides museum visitors, and all of them are watched by the theatre spectators, who are also museum visitors and city residents. The pastime of archaeological discovery emerges with the tour's sudden interruption. The protagonists of the past are archaeologists in the excavation field, citizens worrying about the fate of the finds, journalists writing brilliant articles about the great discovery, a writer narrating the events from his own point of view, a ministry official, a refugee settled in Thessaloniki, a couple in love. From my perspective, however, it was desirable to give voice to the monuments themselves. Carrying the burden of the cause, these otherwise silent witnesses of past events could comment on, supplement, or contradict official choices by bringing to light lesser-known aspects of the past. For the manifestation of this discourse, I chose poetry as a means that could express the subtext, the meaning lying underneath the text, according to Stanislavski's system. Poetry could challenge the dominant discourse, touching on difficult aspects of cultural heritage that we are ignored, but also could express the human condition, the issues that concerned ordinary people at the time when important antiquities were coming to light. Almost all the selected poems are by Maria Kendrou Agathopoulou, a Thessalonican writer, poet, so that the project can be seen as a tribute to this great poet of Thessaloniki, as well as to the local writer George Ioannou, whose short stories were also used in the composition of the text. It should also be noted that in most cases I used exact quotations from the other written sources, such as the journalistic reports and the archaeological studies. The first act, entitled Stone Lovers, concerns an Attic sarcophagus from Roman times that was found along with other similar ones in November 1929 during the construction of an avenue in northwestern Thessaloniki. Due to the lack of relevant documents in the museum's archive, information was out in the local press. The journalist reports echoed the importance of the ancient past for Thessaloniki, incorporated in the Greek state in 1912 after a long period under the Ottoman rule. As the antiquities were perceived as evidence of the national narrative of unbroken historical continuity, the delay of the excavation and later the official decision to move the ancient finds from the urban field to the archaeological museum, we are met with suspicion by the city's inhabitants. One of them, a Greek refugee from Asia Minor, expressed his strong dissatisfaction by sending letters to the city central administration and the local press. In fact, the inhabitants, as aspiring rescuers of ancient heritage, motivated by a sense of national duty, were so suspicious of the archaeological service that they tried to prevent the collection of the finds by the local official curator of antiquities. Evstratios Pelekidis was that man, who was waiting for government funding to move the monument to the museum. Stone lovers, however, were not the only ones who attended the archaeological discovery. While its chronicle is presented through the conversation between the other dramatic figures, such as the residents, the journalist, and the curator of antiquities, young couple appears on stage in search of a romantic secret nest, as in the verses of a poem by Dinos Christianopoulos, used for the text of their role. The only one who seems to have any idea of their existence is the writer George Ioannou.
Εδώ δεν είναι τρόπος να πλανιάσουμε. Αντάφνιτσι μου, δεν τα τριγόνια πόλου και προφίλου. Όλα σκόμμενα ρέμα, όλα που είναι και κακό. Δεν μοιάζει να λουκάσει να ρεδιάει το κόμμα σου. Εδώ δεν είναι τρόπος να ησυχάσουμε. Αυτό το ρεμπέλι που μου χάλασε όλο το κέφι. Μπορκώνει το μέσα μου καθώς αγκαλιάζω. Μου κάνει κακό να ακούω για ξένη τελείως. Εδώ δεν είναι τόπος για μας.
Εδώ δεν είναι τόπος για μας.
Ένα βράδυ περνούσα από τη διεθνή έκθεση και με χαρά διαπίστωσα πως η σαρκοφάγος είχε γίνει φωλιά από ένα ζευγάρι με αρώνα στόματα.
Ioannou appears on stage and almost monologues, indirectly commenting on what was said by the people involved in the excavation. Ioannou narrates the story of a couple in love who used an ancient stone sarcophagus located somewhere in the city as a secret love nest. This is the theme of the well-known short story entitled The Sarcophagus. On stage, the young lovers, hidden inside the stone larnax, are speaking through poems by Maria Kendrou Agathopoulou, expressing their fear of being discovered. The woman even begs her lover to speak by simply moving his lips. The verses of the poems interspersed as at various points in the action, suggested that the sarcophagus was the young couple's last refugee. a place for the protection of their love after death, as it is also suggested by the decoration of the lid of the case in the form of a bed on which the deceased couple buried in it is depicted. Thus, it is as if the excavation represents the violent abolition of the lover's desire for their eternal coexistence. Deserted love cannot close its crazy eye because it is threatened by grave robbers, as Agathopoulou writes. Thus, this theatrical act attempts to recall the human history of love and death behind an ancient material object that is considered merely as an archaeological artifact and museum exhibit. The second act has the title, Please Tell Miss Pelekanidou that they are looking for her. Is the act, the transition to the act is through the continuation of the visitors tour.
Την προσοχή σας παρακαλώ, εδώ στην Ξαναπώ. Καλησπέρα σας κυρίες και κύριοι. Καλωσορίσατε στο Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο και στη μόνιμη έκθεση για τη Θεσσαλονίκη. Σήμερα θα σας ξεναγήσω στη Μυραλιώτισσα, το άγαλμα της οποίας βρέθηκε στην πλατεία της αρχαίας.
So, the archaeologists guide the visitors and also the museum visitors to a Roman female statue in the type of the small Herculaneum woman using experts from the archaeological study of it. When he states that this tattoo enriches our knowledge of the extraordinary Greek sculpture in late antiquity, the dramatic character attributed to the statue claims a different identity by speaking through the poem 13 of Kendrou Agathopoulou. What if I am a hostage forgotten in long deadlines for exchange or transition, in imaginary places, in immovable and irremovable states, where they know me and they don't know me? What if I am an everyday dress, a precious or an abandonment, on the street or in bed? The poem's ambiguous lines that challenge the archaeological description allude to the statue's adventurous contemporary history, which is presented as the action unfolds. The female statue was discovered by Nazi officers during military excavations in the ancient agora of Thessaloniki in 1944, a discovery that was actually filmed according to photographic evidence of the time and described in the short story In the Burnt Lands by Ioannou, who recounts the events as he himself experienced them as a child in Nazi-occupied Thessaloniki, where he saw people dying of hunger every day.
Το μέρος της πλατείας με σειρματοπλέγματα. Γέμισαν με εκατοντάδες αυτοκίνητα πολλές φορές την μετάνηση. Φυσικά επίταξαν τα περισσότερα σπίτια της γειτονιάς, πετώντας με αδιαφορία το κοσμάκι στους 5 δρόμους.
The Nazis handed over the statue in the curator of antiquities, Stylianos Pelekanidis, in a pompous ceremony, even issuing an official statement in which they presented themselves as the ideal protectors of antiquities. Soon, however, the Nazis took the sculpture back and secretly transported it to Austria. There they hid it in a salt mine with other valuable artworks that had been stolen from European museums and collections to be exhibited in a museum dedicated to Hitler. The statue was repatriated in 1949. Sources for this act's textual composition were the studies of Pelekanidis, Efter P. Marquis and Eleftheria Krivopoulou, along with various official documents kept in the museum's archive, as also the aforementioned short story of Ioannou. For decades, the statue was known by the nickname Miss Pelekanidou, as it was associated with the career of Stylianos Pelekanidis, who first published it. In his study, excuse me, sorry. In his study, Pelekanidis describes with scientific precision every detail of the sculpture, but he summarizes the adventure of the monument to just a few lines in a footnote. His text is characterized by vividness, dramatic tone, and poetic mood. Pelekanidis seems to be trying not only to interpret the sculptor's choices, but also to divine the identity and even the psyche of the woman depicted. When he describes the eyes, he says, it is the eyes that set almost all the tone and determine the expression, large and almond-shaped under dense and regular eyebrows. No abrupt or exaggerated movement interrupts the calm and clarity of expression. But immediately after this passionate archaeological description, the statue comments that he had studied only the eyes and not the gaze, when it digs paths between lies and miracles. Speaking with these lines from Kendra Agathopoulou's poem Ophthalmologist, the statue indirectly comments on the archaeological interpretation that selectively highlights aspects of the past, ignoring others or silencing those that constitute a difficult legacy. Pelekanidis' speech is then heard again through the guide. When describing the superficial damage to the statue's head, the dramatic character of the writer Yorgos Ioannou recounts how blood was dripping from the statue's severed neck. Thus, throughout the play, the literary discourse attempts to counter the official narrative, from the pompous Nazis' announcements and confidential correspondence from the Allies acting after the war to repatriate the sculpture, to the scientific archaeological reports of the archaeologists and official decisions. It is the claim of another truth, and the statue becomes an allegory of the people tortured, displaced, and imprisoned during the wars. It is the contradiction of the survivor who, upon returning home, had already lost everything. Through the poem 13 by Kendra Agathopoulos, the statue speaks of the victim's condition. Every day the night falls on the city, and I look for the houses with broken doors, with the number erased on the walls, because of a deep faith in what I have experienced and what I didn't say, because of a deep faith in what my eyes have seen. The statue is the executioner of the city itself, as Thessaloniki left a large part of its population to perish during the war without resistance. Its Jewish population, whose story until their extermination remained for decades on the margins, except in the official national except in the official national narrative. To get out of this soil, died 3 times, as the statue says in the words of the poet Agathopoulos. Indeed, the search for the statue continued until the beginning of the 21st century. In 2016, an elderly man, son of the German soldier who was part of the Nazi group that discovered the statue during the war, visited the museum in search of it. He wanted to finally see for himself the statue that had been a dominant theme in his father's wartime narratives. I was fortunate enough to witness this visit with Eleftheria Krivopoulou, who later referred to this event in her article. The reference to this event was also made in the text, and this recent search for the statue was referred to as a search for the father figure through Yannis Ritsos' poem The Eyes of the Statue. And the story goes on. 2 years ago, students of a technical high school in Thessaloniki borrowed the title of our text and presented the second act at their school as part of a European educational project. And the last act, with a title borrowed from a verse of the poem Lament by Kendra Agathopoulos, concerns the discovery of the famous crater of the 4th century before Christ, found in a tomb at the site of Derveni near Thessaloniki in 1962. Sources for the text of this act were the archaeological official documents and the journalistic reports. Once again, the act begins with the continuation of the tour of the visitors who listen to the archaeologists narrating the chronicle of the discovery of the crater. But the tour is interrupted when the four figures decorating the shoulder of the crater come to life. Dionysus, Satyr, and two Maenads are transformed into a group of young friends. The protagonist among them is Satyr, who is a motorcyclist, like the hero of Kendrou Agathopoulos' homonymous poem. As according to the poem, he will soon be killed on the road, he asks his friends to take a picture of him and send it to his girlfriend. He wants his new leather jacket and his iron helmet to look good in the photo, but mostly he wants the vertigo on his face and the inevitability of death to be obvious. Satyr's death alludes to other deaths, the one related to the use of the crater containing burnt human remains and the death narrated by the guide immediately afterwards when the action returns to the present, the death of a worker who, while working on the excavation, was crushed by the slab covering the ancient tomb. This tragic event was recorded in the relevant press reports of the time and was recently reported by the archaeologist Petros Themelis, who had carried out the excavation. Thus, in the third act, the narrative of the chronicle of a major archaeological discovery serves as a reminder of the existential anguish of man, who for centuries has been inventing myths and rituals as allegorical performances of imminent and inevitable death that constitutive condition of life. Evaluating the results of the play, I hope that I succeeded in showing that monuments are not only objects of narrative, as in the context of their archaeological study, but narrative subjects that, although it will be centuries until their story is told, will tell stories to visitors and even stories about themselves. I would argue that the real protagonists of the play are its audience, the museum's visitors who participated both as spectators of the theatre and as residents of the city. So the theatrical narrative, moving through their own lived urban space and evolving antiquities, was really about them. They themselves are the performers of the city. In fact, it was also about us, as we aren't just museum curators, but also citizens, spectators, actors. We are all actors, as said. Moreover, the museum offered the theatre its own world, which the theatre enriched by returning it back to the museum. The theatre within the theatre, that is a museum, can contribute to the revelation and performance of counter-memory, often untold in the museum narrations. For the most interesting challenge for theatre in museum is to highlight the human condition by telling the silenced stories of powerless people, even if it has to question the dominant discourse of museums. The latter must at least promise a better world. Otherwise, as Nanos Valaoritis wonders in his poem Excavation, why should the archaeological excavation operate? The deep woods that the soil healed in our bodies, from darkness bringing to sunlight the mutilated states. Thank you for your attention and patience with my English.
Thank you, Styliana. Thank you for this interesting presentation and for keeping the time. Everyone is very tired. It's the last session. You were great. So we will go on with the second presentation for today. It's from Mrs. Areti Konvilidou. Mrs. Konvilidou, yes. She has studied archaeology, social anthropology, and theater. and she works for the Modern Monuments and Technical Works of Central Macedonia for the Ministry of Culture. And her presentation title is The Walking Stick.
Hello again. Well, this time I'll be a little bit more serious than the last time you saw me here. A case study, and it's about literature, local history, theater, and museum. So the case study is an exhibition that was named Andonis Sourounis, Paths and Seas, and that took place in the cultural venue of Islahane. That is a new museum in the city of Thessaloniki, and you are all welcomed. A listed monument in the edge of the upper town of Thessaloniki, the old city of Thessaloniki, a writer born in the same neighborhood, an exhibition devoted to him. The above conditions gave birth to an original theater representation inside the museum and an educational program with theater techniques that took also place in the exhibition. Is that museum theater? What is a theater performed in a museum? What is a theater born by the museum itself? I would like to present you the different approaches that took place during the exhibition Adonis Sourounis, Paths and Seas, in the cultural venue of Islahane. It was a happy encounter that, according to the participants, I skipped a line. And it was based on two different texts of Andonis Sourounis. So we have literature, local history, theater, and museum. A happy encounter that, according to the participants, left them with joyfully surprising feelings. The theater representation was called Path to the Sea, Μονοπάτι στη θάλασσα, was based on the autobiographical novel of the same title, and the walking stick το μπαστούνι, στα ελληνικά, was based on the unique story tale of the writer, and it was performed with school groups, but once also to adult visitors. So, let me allow, I hope you allow me to introduce you a little bit to our museum. I'm making the... so, the cultural venue of Islahane. The building that houses the cultural venue is a centenarian building with a fascinating history. Thessaloniki, the second biggest town of Greece, was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1912. In the late Ottoman period, in 1874, an orphanage with a technical school was founded, and it was the institution called Islahane, a Turkish word. Although it was created by the initiative of the Muslim community, the institution accepted children with one or no parent, destitute children, but of all religions. The facilities were developed in 4 buildings. So we had the dormitory, the main school, the printing house, and the workshops. A carpenter workshop and a machine shop, a foundry, and a smithery workshop welcomed the orphan students to be taught the specific arts and crafts in order to live their lives in a decent and useful way. Also available to the students were the art of printing, lithography, shoemaking, sewing, and detail work. Well, with the departure of the Muslim population, due to the accorded exchange of population between Greece and Turkey with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the building the institution stopped, ceased its function, and the ownership passed on to the Greek state. After that, the building became, what do I have here? Sorry. Yeah. After that, the building became a factory. And it used to be on function until the 80s, where we found it. And at first, we just knew it was that it was a building of industrial interest with all the equipment inside, etc. Later on, by searching, we found out that it used to be part of the institution of Islahane. So, since 2017, it is open, it is transformed into a museum, and it is open to the public. The permanent exhibition of the museum has to do with the history of the building. So it's a museum of itself that tells its own story. But in its own story, we are trying to add more stories. So we are using, of course, we like to work a lot with the school groups. I believe that we ought to work a lot with the school groups. Our technical, our methods when we accept children is, otherwise I wouldn't be here, is mostly drama techniques. So having the chance to work there, having some kind of knowledge of theater and some kind of knowledge of history, I'm trying to combine all of this, and I hope it kind of works. So I will skip some of the things that I have because we're kind of tired, all of us. I know. So the theatrical representation, Path to the Sea. So this is the writer, Adonis Sourounis, who was born next to where we are. So he was the inspiration. And mostly the inspiration was his book, Μονοπάτι στη θάλασσα. This book is autobiographical, and he tells us, in fact, it's his childhood. But it's so humorous, so sarcastic, so clever, that since I read it, I am walking on the streets of this neighborhood because I live there and I work there. And I see through his eyes. So I needed to do something about it. So 3 years after his death, I tried to do it before he was still in life, but unfortunately he wasn't well in the last few years. So in October 2019, we organized the exhibition Path and Seas, devoted to the writer Adonis Sourounis. So I said all of this. In an exhibition about a writer, the exhibits to display are not quite evident, since the produced work of art are books. So I want to do something about a writer, but what should I display about the writer? He writes books. In fact, by searching, I had access to some of his books, of his belonging. So I said, I would be very curious to see what does a writer reads. So I did found and had displayed some a part. Sorry, I didn't tell you about this photo. This is an inspiration, this photo. The book, as I told you, is A Path to the Sea. The whole story talks about how, when he was young, well, the whole story, the book is like this, so there are many stories, but the title is, when he was young, he was jumping on the roof of his house, and his grandfather told him, "What do you see over there?" "I see the Mount Olympus," because in fact it is right opposite from us. And when he was young, he said, it's really close. We should go over there. And his grandfather told him, "Yeah, when there's the sea in front of you, everything seems very close. One day, you will find the path to the sea to arrive there." So a friend of his sent me this photo. And I thought it's him, okay? And it's a personal photo. But I believe it should be the coverage of the next edition of this book. Well, I'm coming back. Sorry, I'm just inspired with Surunis. I could talk to you many hours. So I will just show you some images. So what was the exhibition about? Not explaining a lot. You can see that there are books, there are personal belongings of him. And then there was this other thing. What do you write about a writer? Am I permitted to write about someone who writes better than me? So what I did is I tried to collect extracts from his work that I thought describe him or present him or talk about him. So I let him talk about him. So on the panels, you see, I created a kind of, I named it 23 letters plus one, because when he was young, he couldn't say one word. So he said, the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, it's not about 24 letters, it's 23. So I made 23 letters plus one for him. We addressed a call to the National Theatre of Northern Greece, who responded positively, and we are thankful for that, to present a drama adaptation of the Roman Path to the Sea inside the museum. So a new theatrical play was born, based on a book destined for a museum exhibition. The task was given to Irini Kyriakou to adapt and direct the presentation. You see the name of the three actors. And I will try to show you, so I will not speak about it, just a little extract. The play took place inside the museum, and in specific, in the same place where the exhibition was. Chairs were confronted into two sides of the room. There was a corridor in the middle for the actors to move. All three of them entered the scene and sat in the furniture. We also had a corner with furniture so that someone could read at the same time of the books of the writer. So they are they're taking the book, The Path to the Sea, and they start reading at first and acting later. So another thing we did for this exhibition, we did literature walks. I named it like that. The literature walks were organized into groups in order to walk along the above-mentioned neighborhood, Anopoli, the upper city, and to meet the paths of Anopoli, to meet the house of Adonis Surunis, and to read out loud abstracts of his work, referring to specific spots by actually being there. So we had the Ottoman mansion on the square of Koule Cafe, housing the municipal library of Anopoli today. And we were there, but this building used to be, during Surunis' childhood, an elementary school. And he describes how he would go and wait for a glimpse because a beautiful girl he used to love was going to that school. So it was really, we saw the buildings with a completely different view. We walked in the last image, image at right, you can see his house, but it's not the original one. And he writes about that. It's not the old house. At some point, unfortunately, he said his family wanted to modernize and get not an old Turkish house, but the new one. Well, we talked about his description are very live. We could see the old Ottoman fountain, non-existing today, right across his natal house. The still existing stone wall. The stone wall is the first photo. There's a big wall. And he tells how they were hiding a stolen ball when they were young. Well, I will go a little bit more quickly. And then last part of this exhibition was to use methods, theatrical methods, for the educational program. The educational program was inspired by this book, so The Walking Stick. And this book it's an allegory, in fact. It's a cynical allegory about our lives and our choices. The story is about a tree that has been cut, transferred to a carpenter's workshop, and transformed into a table. Little by little, the table realizes that the life of a table is no good. So he wants to become something else. I will try to show you some footage, some video of this, so I will not describe it anymore. You can watch the photos. We start by the narration of the book, in fact. And later on, we are doing something like we did just now. I mean, I'm starting with narrating. Children are just listening. I'm involving them without prevention at first. I'm taking one or two to do things. They're hesitating at first. And then get up. It's your turn. You will continue the story. They're like, what will we do, etc. And they become, I just realized that I had the method that Angela said it, inanimate object. Animate object. So, in this story, those children became beds, tables, libraries, and ticket clocks. Because in the book, the book is all the protagonists of the book are made of wood. They are the furnitures. So, of course, the children at first react how can I be a bed? And as you can imagine, we can be everything we can, and it works just fine. At the end, at some point in the book, the table crashes into pieces. And it is abandoned. An old man passes and finds one leg of the table. So he takes the one leg and he transforms it into a walking stick. And then this wood finally likes it. And it's happy. It's more interesting to be a walking stick than a table. And now it's the time to reflect. So maybe for someone it's very interesting to be a table, not for everyone. And maybe someone likes to be a library, but no, me, never. I would like to be. So the whole story was finishing with the if I were a tree, what would I be? So I could be a boat, children, everyone was writing in a small paper what he would like to become. And I collected all the answers because I realized that some children didn't want to tell what they wanted to become in front of their schoolmates. So no one knew what wrote, and they keep asking, who wrote that? Who wrote that? So someone wanted to become a boat so that it can travel, a scarecrow to impress people and birds. Someone would become a piano because he likes music. Someone would become a book for people to read, or a paintbrush because he or she liked colors. One day, and I will finish here, I'll just tell you that one day I made an open call without clarifying exactly what will the participants do. So I said, come to participate to dramatize the manifestation. I don't remember how I said that, I wrote that, in the museum based on this novel. So some people came and they thought that they will see something, a small play. Of course, they were very surprised when I gradually asked them to do things. And at the end, they just loved it. They loved it. It was great. In fact, afterwards, I wanted to do it only with adults, but it's not easy. I prefer the adults at some point because, well, it's very interesting in another way. In fact, when they finished, when this finished with adults, they told me, can we make a group of theater? Can we meet here every week and do stuff like that all the time? It has not happened yet, but it's still here. Maybe one day. So I will just finish with this great phrase. I thought it would be interesting. That museum and theater can walk along in various ways. Museum and theater can walk various paths. They can cross many seas and stand for each other as a man with his walking stick. So thank you. Do I have time to show you some minutes of, No? Huh? Okay, well, not all of it.
Το τραπέζι ένιωσε ξαφνικά δυο χέρια να το σηκώνουν ψηλά. Σου εύχομαι να γίνεις βάρκα. Φαίνεται τις διαστάσεις του ουσίου. Δεν πρέπει να μας πει πώς νιώθει.
Είσαι κρεβάτι, έχει και καλά και κακά πράγματα. Όπως μ' αρέσει να φιλοξενώ ανθρώπους πάνω μου. Όταν το στρώνω, του αρέσει. Παρόλο που κουνιέμαι όλη την ώρα, δεν είναι τίποτα το παρετό.
I use this music, let them in silence, think about what they will be. And I'm trying to tell them a little bit that sometimes we might need to be smashed into pieces. We might need to pass through several furniture to arrive to the one we feel good about it. And sometimes at the end, people there are children that were quite moved and needed a hug, and it was very emotional. one, I also have put English subtitles for you.
Έμοιαζε
Play.
με ποτάμι, γεμάτο ριάκια και παραπότα. Αλλά με ποτάμι ανάποδα. Αντί να κατεβαίνει, ανέβαινε και αντί να χύνει. Άμα βρούμε κανένα μονοπάτι στη θάλασσα...
Άμα βρούμε κανένα μονοπάτι στη θάλασσα, μπορεί και να πάμε καμιά μέρα.
Το ξέραμε. Όλοι έργο του Θεού είμαστε. Και όλες οι μανάδες μας, καθαρίστριες, πλήστρες, παρηγορήτριες και δεν ξέρω κι εγώ τι άλλο. Εμείς τα παιδιά δεν μοιάζαμε τον αστάλο, ήμασταν αλλιώτικα.
Άντρες, γυναίκες, παιδιά, γέροι, γριές, μικροί, μεγάλοι, όλοι στη γειτονιά είχανε παρατσού.
Εσύ, για να δω. Δεν μου λες. Το ξέρεις αυτόν εκεί. Το χοντρό, το κοντό.
Ο κύριος Άρης. Όλοι το ξέρουν τον κύριο Άρη. Δέκα σαν κι αυτόν να είχαμε στο σώμα, εμείς τα όργανα, να τα χρειαζόταν να κάνουμε καμιά δουλειά, Όλα αυτοί θα τα κάνανε.
Μα, γιατί δηλαδή, τι δουλειά κάνει ο κύριος Άρης, εσύ.
Τι δουλειά κάνει, λέει, την καλύτερη. Πουλάει και αγοράζει ανθρώπους. Μας αγοράζει τζάπα και μας πουλάει και σάφ.
Δηλαδή, τι σόι ανθρώπους αγοράζει.
Όλα τα σόγια και όλες τις ράτσες. Γερμανούς, Ιταλούς, Εβραίους, κομμουνίστες, Έλληνες, αντάρτες, πλούσιους, φτωχούς, λαμόγια, όλους, λέω, όλους.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you, Areti. And we will finish with Miss Patricia Kokoris. Miss Kokoris is an assistant professor here at the Department of Communication, Media and Culture in Panteion University of Social and Political Studies. And her presentation today is titled 821 in Review Sketches as Meta-Nationalistic Narrative, a Paradigm for Museum Theatre.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm exhausted. I don't know about you. I don't know. Does somebody want to read this paper? Can I start by saying how much I've appreciated today? I teach a course in history of theatre and a course in performance theory, and all my other teaching is communication studies, cultural studies, media studies. So when I heard that our department was going to host this conference, I felt obliged to somehow contribute because I'd heard from students how enthused they were from the workshop that Professor Andromachi Gazi, and of course with the input of Fotini. So can I thank you all for today's experience, because I'd only heard from students and I'd seen the exhibitions, of course, that Professor Gazi prepared with her students. So at the time, what was it, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when we were submitting our abstracts, I heard that a young director was going to put on a review, and this was, of course, the time that Greece was celebrating the 200-year bicentenary. When I saw the proposal, I can't even think at the moment, the press releases announcing the call for papers for input from various young writers for this project, I thought, what is he thinking of doing? A review, using the review for commemorating such an important event. And that's because review uses mostly topical or satirical sketches centred on reversal, of norms and parody. It is a stage space of comedy, music, and dance that becomes hilariously unconventional and at the same time prepares spectators for encountering human experiences that correspond to their realities. So choosing the review medium to commemorate the bicentenary of Greece's independence from 4 centuries of Ottoman rule seemed like an audacious experiment that risked failure because the form itself would most likely trivialize realities of the past for light entertainment value. So taking the 1821 review as a case study, I wish to explore the hypothesis that this popular form has been instrumental in Greece for presenting the historical and, in the past, the suppressed by official censorship, especially during periods when democracy ceased in the land that discovered democracy. The general reception of this 2021 review confirmed that the delight in the trivial, the luminous emphasis on kitsch, and giddying comedic tone of the production's aesthetics did not detract from a sense of history. As I will attempt to elucidate, a number of the 15 sketches, I won't refer to all 15, and 6 satiric songs intimated a critique of ideological interpretations of history without intellectualizing. The production achieved its effects by using the genre's popular forms of grand spectacle and playfulness to stage commemorating national independence in camp style, one that appeals because of its bad taste and ironic perspective. The comic, therefore, becomes an instrument for reviewing the normative. In the historical retrospective that the 1821 review skits compose, there is the comic return of the repressed, what has been ignored in the humanist glorification of heroes and cultural uniqueness, and leaves its targets open to critical exposure. The humour grounds heroic figures of the past in base reality. However, it does not undermine the essence of the historical struggle. The freedoms won for the Greeks by the War of Independence remain a focal point, but the humorous treatment of how national independence has evolved or how the revolution has been celebrated is informed by contemporary perspectives. One that acknowledges the subjectivity of official accounts of history and the artifice of national identity when based on essence-centred concepts such as national consciousness. What was new then was that the performance emphasised the performative aspect of national identity by indicating it is conjured and reinforced through ritualistic repetition. The humorous epic gesturing of the opening invokes a panorama of moments and festivities celebrating the modern Greek history. From behind the luminous curtain forming part of the backdrop, 3 actors emerge dressed in traditional national costume. One also adorning silver minotaur horns, proudly dancing to the tune of folk song. The curtain framed with dazzling lights and a sign reading 200 years of successes doubles as the theatre troupe's advertising slogan and more pointedly suggests the bicentenary funfair. A recorded voice echoes fragments from a famous speech, urging the heirs to no longer revere the revolution heroes, but to progress through education and cultivation. These words merge with that of the review commentator, who recites the phrases in sober tone, reverberating the significance of maintaining the essence of their ancestors' legacy in the past. Next, a science fiction time tunnel opens with flashing lights, and the chorus appears wearing garish ancient Greek tunics with classic to contemporary footwear. Instantly, the entire stage turns into a landscape of ancient ruins and modern settings. Byzantine folk and jazz tunes underscore the fragmented or layered images of a hybridized postmodern aesthetic and the bad taste of cheap glamour. The latter evokes the grandiose patriotic musical parades that exalted the grandeur of the ancient past and the image of the nationalistic patriot during the military dictatorship reign from 1967 to 74. concept further rarefied at the time with images in all public speech, education, and in the 150-year celebrations of the revolution. On this stage, the actors morph into multiple images to allow for the respective illusions. Greek Revolution rebel dressed in Balkan warrior costume. 19th century Philoline, archaeologist, someone in a tailored suit pointing the way forward. A stage assistant brought back images of the frantic clean-up operation of Athens before the 2004 Olympics. To an ironic drag queen impersonation of Yana Agelopoulou, the chairwoman of the Olympic Celebrations Committee. The opening song played on Yana's name and that of a popular folk song's title, gesturing the satirical turn that was to follow. The Livorias's lyrics describe the passage from the innocence of pre-civilized beings to having lost any true sense of national identity because it has all been socially imposed by rote learning. The song ends with innuendo castigating the costly extravaganza of the opening ceremony for the Olympics and reminds spectators that this old tune has been dragging on for 200 years. The comment is made wittily, of course. The image of the Olympic Games souvenir scarf worn for good luck by the actors in the hope they'll get work that year, having been denied financial aid during the first 2020 lockdown. Ironically, the sketch that follows the first, which I'm not making mention of, where it is stated that the purpose is to celebrate the uniqueness of the Greek soul via a journey through our rich history, is titled No Greece at All. Yana has a marketing expert help her rebrand Greece, who advises effacing the Zorba stereotype. He proposes strategies that satirically target the strict policies during lockdown: no theatre, no dancing, no democracy, and the very idea of reimagining national culture for marketing purposes. A parody of how national history is celebrated in school follows. The sketch presents a rehearsal for the recitation of a poem, giving voice to a revolution hero. When the teacher asks, "How did the poem make you feel?" the student confesses, "I can't utter these words, it's just not me," but likes the idea that those heroes revolted against suppression. When she explains this was not anarchy, but in a time without institutions such as nation, law, or justice, he quips, "Why do we have them now?" Adding to insult, he diminishes the national hero's masculinity, repulsed by its brutish baseness. The teacher's retort is an ecstatic, nationalistic paroxysm where words run amok, adulating the hero's manliness, brilliance, and self-sacrifice. A humiliating comparison is made in her description of them as the superhuman Titan fighters of the revolution and of the student as the pampered, culturally illiterate youth of today. To which he responds, "With all the racial tampering, I'm not even Greek. I'm half Afghan-American, Portuguese, African, and I'm proud of it." Oops. That was a slide. Yeah, at which point she drops in frustration, having failed to instill knowledge of national virtues. Despite the exaggeration of the stereotypes necessary for the review counter-reading of nationalistic rhetoric, the teacher's accolade of the revolution fighter's legacy redirects attention to cultural memory. Put differently, after the audience's raucous laughter had settled, one felt that even if shards of the unrestrained praise lingered in a spectator's memory, this could lead to reflection about the then and now. Instead of merely glorifying the heroism that led to historical progress in another skit titled No Longer Look Up to Us, we were transposed to an imaginary dialogue between the two most revered 1821 revolution heroes. The scene suggests the the different educational backgrounds of the people dedicated to the cause of independence. It also functions as a reminder of the views causing division among Greeks. Those who believed the European powers' insistence on providing a monarchy to rule the newly formed state was driven by their geopolitical interests, and those on the side of the powers that be seeking positions and financial gain, which meant diminishing ideals for the common good. An imagistic panorama of moments in more recent public life follows. The scene, composed by the director Karadzias, was reminiscent of the parade of decorative floats in the opening ceremony of the Athens Olympics. Yet rather than an exhibition of images alluding to antiquity and folklore with proud nostalgia, here the posters on floats display politicians and media celebrities. Only one fleeting image seems to pay homage to Enlightenment figures who promoted a European cosmopolitanism against nationalism. The thinker in contemplation, as he holds the ruin of a broken statue, also alludes to a poem by Nobel laureate poet George Seferis, which expresses the paralyzing burden of the past for the modern and sadness for all the knowledge lost from the classics. Yana, of course, introduces the passing floats with deadpan revere, and in its cumulative effect, the parade suggests knowledge of the past has been replaced with other preoccupations. Most images evoke disillusioning or embarrassing moments of recent times. The parade mise-en-scene included images of Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou, one of the post-dictatorship saviors. So the image of him boarding off the plane with the air hostess in the background, who became his mistress and later second wife, was reminiscent not so much of the personal scandal, but of the whole period. Idealized as an enlightened socialist leader, any faults were overlooked by supporters until the cataclysm of scandals involving his party's ministers brought it to its end. Now, the allusion to his popularist style of politics brought to mind the general sense of betrayal felt by many. None was spared the sarcasm in this parade of sheer spectacle and stage play. Karadzias confronted spectators with an uncomfortable reminder of incidents indicative of how far removed some in Greek society are from the vision and sacrifices of the revolution, with mention of the 213 Manolada incident, the shooting of 33 Bangladeshi workers on a strawberry farm protesting against the exploitation, where 8 were seriously injured. Images of forgotten media icons were paraded, as if to suggest in the 3 decades before the financial crisis, they helped transform the active subject of the revolution, as well as of the pre-war and dictatorship period, into a passive cynic and consumer elite. A poster depicting an extreme right-wing politician who sells nationalist propaganda in books on Greek history and Christian teachings on telemarketing underlined that the two doctrines are complicit in imposing various forms of suppression on the modern subject. The sketch that provoked some negative responses for its lengthy, hysterical, hypercomedic overemphasis, in the words of one reviewer, was that of Takoumas, the high-heeled one. It opens with an unidentified revolution fighter singing a song celebrating his effeminate nature as he comes to give an interview on the reality show Voice. He recalls entering the revolutionary struggle as an 18-year-old, impassioned like most of the fighters, eager to kill Turks, fearless, not like today's faint-hearted youth who think it was like PlayStation, with no belief in anything. Apparently a victim of sexual abuse, The TV presenter pressures him to publicly name the captain who had molested him, which nuanced the 2021 abuse cases exposed, and a more direct reference was made to the Olympic athlete who prompted the Greek Me Too movement. On another note, the proud mother of the revolution fighter says she first entered The Voice to praise her gay son with her song. However, when she gets to Eurovision, ambition for fame supersedes maternal concern, a sarcastic comment ridiculing the contemporary obsession with celebrity identity. The review stage is often used as a site for resisting and redressing conventional gender roles. So too in the sketch, featuring a patriotic hero alongside the contemporary presenter and the image of Takunas becoming the gay icon of the revolution. The ridicule is above all directed at the values and discourses of straight society that exclude LGBTQ+ gender and sexual identity. This came as an effective sequel to a previous skit that sarcastically deflated the macho manliness with which heterosexual Greek males often define their cultural nationalism. That is, their supposed uniqueness as best lovers, most intelligent of all races, came across as the nation's toxic masculinity. I'll skip quite a few sketches because I realise you're tired. So the ending took an unexpected sober turn. We have to get to the ending now. Plastic sheets were rolled out to cover the stage setting, indicating the spectacle was over. Then, from under the covers, ghosts of 3 other emblematic figures of the revolution appear. It is they who have wished to commune with the living, arranging a séance for those that are listening. Lord Byron appears. I don't need to say who he is. The Philoline dedicated to the cause with huge financial support and active involvement. So it is a sober reminder. Another moving figure to appear here is Mando Mavrogenous, the educated merchant's daughter who had organised resistance against the Turks in Mykonos, had sent her ships to support other battles of the revolution and offered all her wealth to the cause. Yet she died abandoned in poverty because of the political rivalry that followed victory. And the apparition of Athanasios Diakos, the military commander, relates his torturous death at the hands of the Turks. The dimly lit stage served both as a tribute to the historic forebearers of liberated Greece and as a litany of a homeland that moderns mourn. Sounds of whirlwind mixed with distant voices of protest and other moments of national catastrophe, as when the dictators set their tanks against the students in the Polytechnic. The words of the late composer Manos Hatzidakis and others featured as poetic reminders that resistance is needed to other threats that lurk for the survival of national culture. A point dramatised by the young woman who informs the heroes of how life is in the present. She conveys the loss of ideals and paranoia that some Greeks have been driven to with the different social crises, concluding by telling them they've arrived too late and their sacrifices were in vain. The girl's words encapsulate a bitterness and cynicism felt by a substantial majority of overeducated but under or unemployed Greeks. A nihilism also manifested towards the possibility of betterment through radical activism. Still, the scene ends with the 3 revolution heroes giving the girl one of their distinctive possessions as a token of their support to fortify the fighting spirit of their cultural descendants. Having conjured conflicting images of different moments in the country's history to help better understand its complexities, in the proceeding, the finale is in review cheer, with another satirical version of the Yano Your Scarf song and mention of Ithaca, the symbol of reaching a homeland after long journeying. I think I'll skip my conclusion.
you so much. I think we have like a few minutes for a short Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. And there is a... So, are there any questions? Yes.
I would like to ask from Arati that if this Suruni a well-known writer? Okay. Is he a well-known writer? So people, how did you attract people to come to see the theater piece and the city walk? Did you have to do many marketing or?
Our marketing team is non-existing. Thank God, internet, Facebook helps a lot. And so it was, okay, the National Theatre of Greece promoted, so it is quite, it has a big impact, okay. But it was mostly through internet. Well, I did tape some posters also in the neighborhood, but that was it. What was interesting is that when I asked the collaboration from the National Theatre of Greece, at first they told me, okay, we could do something like what we call in Greek analogio. It means two actors just read. I said, no, you don't get it. We want to do, we have imagined something more. Well, I did, at first I wanted it to be in the neighborhood played. But it was difficult. They didn't accept that. So they gave me this. We will do it in the place, in the museum, not in your theater. I didn't want at all to be played in the theater, only inside the exhibition. So the fact that they didn't, they thought it was difficult to do in the neighborhoods, that gave me the idea to do the literature walks myself with people. And we planned at first only 3 representations. I wanted 30, but okay, they gave me 3 at first. Because they were professional actors, so they had other representations, they are paid, etc. And it was such a success, and in fact, they didn't expect to have such an appeal. But in fact, I realized that I'm a good marketing producer. I just realized that. And it was full. It was sold out. All 3 representations, days before the representation. So I called again and said, you see, it's sold out. You have to give us some more days. We want more representations. And we added some more. And it could go more and more. And what was interesting is that people who had read the book and they came to the exhibition, and the ones that saw the representation and participated to the walks, they had an experience. They told me that it all it was it was a full experience. That the one completed the other. And that from a book, many different things gave birth, and that now they have experienced it better. Well, I said a lot, sorry.
there are some.
I would like to hear your conclusion. The short version. I thought it was magnificent. Using the review for such an important anniversary.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by what they were attempting to do, and when I made the proposal, I didn't know what I was going to see. Right? And this involved 15 sketches, 2.5-hour performance. It was a summer performance in an open air with a beautiful view of Pires Port. But it was just so well received. You could sense who the nationalists were, who stomped out when they saw Takunas. That was about 3. There would have been about 2,000 in the audience. So, yeah, something more specific. My conclusion was long. Basically, it was that these were young people. For Greece, they were young. Like when you're in your 30s, mid-30s, you're just getting your chance to make your break. And it was clear that they were informed by contemporary perspectives. The gay issue has been a very sensitive one, and it's sort of coming out publicly now, very recently. So this was, if you like, an agenda. But it wasn't limited to that. I think it was a good overview of recent history too, and was confronting audiences with that.
Can I extend the question here? Because I was thinking that we I'll speak as a museum professional, what we strive to do is to create relevant and dialogic gallery spaces where a broader audience feels welcome. So do you think, that would be a question for all of you, that through museum theater, and especially a theater like a review, that will kind of like question dominant narratives, this can be
These were young people. Most of the writers were late 20s, mid 30s, university graduates, half of them, and well read. There was unevenness in the writing because, again, it was a call for writing. So some were rushed, some were worked. But hearing everything today, I thought they would really benefit from this, from what you're doing. Because a skit can be 3 minutes, can be 10, can be 9 minutes. But this has been done time and time again, this review and reviewing the contention parts of Greek history. And you know that, the Greeks know that. Review has that reputation in Greece.
Yes, because for me, sorry for my input, but it's just that I look at things from a different perspective, and for me it was very interesting in all the presentations, like Ms. Galiniki used the archival material and poetry, things that are usually, like, for a broader audience, they are the boring stuff, the archival material, and usually the way we present it in museums is very, boring through, a display. So it was very interesting, or literature, to see how it can be used. Perfect, thank you. Wow, thank you. Why? Are we arrested? Perfect.
Okay, Vikings. Message taken. Okay. If you can spare a few minutes, I know we are all exhausted, but happy, I think. We have some practical issues to announce, and before that, may I ask all the speakers and chairpersons of today to come here on stage, please. Don't worry, it's for a good cause. Jack, you should come also. Jack Veldman. Okay. So, we also have a small present as a university that Konstantina is bringing. Yes, yes. So, as a very humble gesture from the university, to thank you for coming, thank you for delivering your speeches and presentations, and thank you for chairing our sessions. And this includes you, Anna, as well. This is a very small token of our gratitude. Thank you very much.